the warrior who outlived his legend. The old man stood on the windswept cliff and watched the sun paint the kingdom in shades of gold and amber. It was a view he'd seen 1,000 times before, in what felt like another life. 300 years ago, he'd watched sunrises from the backs of war beasts, from blood-soaked battlefields, from the command tent of the greatest army the world had ever known. Back then, the sunrise meant another day of survival, another chance to push back the darkness. Now, it just meant he was still here. Kaelen's joints ached as he shifted his weight, a dull, persistent pain that had become his constant companion over the century. His battle scars, earned in a war that had faded from living memory, had never healed quite right. They pulled at his skin when he moved, a constant reminder of a life that should have ended long ago. 300 years ago, he'd been the youngest general in the Great Demon War, a hero, a legend. Now he was just an old man with no family, no rank, and a body that refused to die. The sound of heavy boots on stone pulled him from his thoughts. Soldiers, a dozen of them, judging by the footfalls, wearing the livery of the local lord. Their leader, a barrel-chested man with a sneer permanently etched into his features, strode forward without a hint of respect. "You there," the soldier barked. "These lands belong to Baron Vex. Vagrants aren't permitted to loiter on noble property. Move along." Kaelen turned slowly, his ancient eyes meeting the soldier's with a calm that should have been unsettling. The soldier didn't notice. None of them did. To them, he was just another beggar, another forgotten soul with nowhere to go. "Of course," Kaelen said, his voice a low rumble that carried the weight of century. "I was just leaving." He didn't argue, didn't explain. What would be the point? The lands below had once belonged to no one, then to everyone, then to the crown, and now to some baron who probably couldn't trace his own lineage back 3 generations, let alone 3 centuries. Ownership was a fleeting thing. Kaelen had learned that lesson in blood. He descended the cliff path slowly, each step deliberate, measured. His body couldn't move like it used to, nothing moved like it used to, but there was still a grace in his gait, the unconscious precision of a man who had spent decades dancing with death. The path wound down into a valley, and it was there that Kaelen stopped. Below him, nestled in a curve of the river, sat a fortress. Once, it might have been impressive. Thick stone walls, a central keep, training grounds large enough for hundreds of warriors. Now, it was a crumbling shadow of its former self. Moss grew between the stone. The training grounds held exactly 7 students, all of them young, all of them swinging wooden swords with the kind of awkward enthusiasm that came from having no real teacher. A sign above the gate, its paint faded and peeling, read, "Azure Willow Academy." Kaelen's breath caught in his throat. He knew that name. He knew the man who had founded it. The memory hit him like a physical blow, a battlefield under a blood-red sky, the screams of the dying all around them, and his closest friend, his brother in arms, lying in his arms with a wound that would not close. Thuron had smiled through the pain, as he always did, and gripped Kaelen's hand with the last of his strength. "Promise me," Thuron had whispered, his voice barely audible above the carnage. "When this is over, when the fighting stops, promise me you'll protect the next generation, train them, make sure they never have to fight a war like this one." Kaelen had promised. He'd held Thuron as he died, and he'd made that promise with every fiber of his being. And then the war had ended. The seal had taken him, and 300 years had passed in the blink of an eye. Kaelen looked at the crumbling academy, at the 7 awkward students, at the faded sign that bore his friend's legacy. Thuron's dream had become this, a laughingstock, a last resort for those with nowhere else to go. The next generation, left to train themselves with wooden swords and hope. His feet were moving before his mind caught up, toward the gates, toward the promise he'd never fulfilled. He was 50 feet from the entrance when a young man stepped into his path. This one was dressed in fine silks, his sword hilt studded with gems that had never seen battle. Behind him, a small entourage of similarly dressed youths snickered and whispered. A noble's son, clearly, and one who thought very highly of himself. "Well, well," the young man drawled, his eyes raking over Kaelen's worn clothing and weathered face. "Another relic applying to the retirement home for failures. I've heard they'll take anyone these days, but this is pathetic even for them." His friends laughed. The sound was brittle, performative. Kaelen said nothing. He simply stepped forward, intending to move around the boy and continue toward the gates. He'd dealt with arrogant children before. They weren't worth his time. But the boy stepped into his path again, emboldened by Kaelin's silence. "I'm talking to you, old man. What business do you have with those losers? Thinking of enrolling. Maybe they need someone to sweep the floors." He reached out, probably to shove Kaelen, to demonstrate his superiority to his friend. His hand never made contact. Kaelen, acting on instincts older than the boy's entire bloodline, simply placed his own hand on the young man's shoulder, a gentle motion, intended only to move him aside. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. A high-pitched whine emanated from the boy's chest, where an expensive pendant glowed with stored defensive magic. The glow intensified, flickered, and then, crack, the pendant exploded into 1,000 fragments, each piece sparkling in the morning light as they rained down around them. The boy stumbled backward, his face gone white, his hand clutching at the empty space where his family's most treasured artifact had been. What did you do?" he stammered. "That was worth more than your entire worthless life. My father will hear of this, he'll—" But Kaelen was already walking past him, through the shattered remnants of the pendant, toward the academy gates. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Behind him, the boy's friends slowly backed away from their leader, their eyes fixed on the old man with a new expression: fear. Chapter 2. The Students Who Don't Believe in Legend. The interior of the Azure Willow Academy was exactly what Kaelen had expected from the outside: neglected, underfunded, and desperately trying to maintain dignity in the face of inevitable decline. The courtyard was swept clean, but the stones were cracked. The training dummies were patched in a dozen places, and the students who gathered to stare at the newcomer looked more like refugees than warriors. All except one. She stood at the front of the small group, arms crossed, chin lifted, eyes blazing with the kind of defiance that Kaelen recognized immediately. He'd seen that look before, on the faces of young recruits who had something to prove, who had been told they weren't good enough their entire lives and were determined to show the world otherwise. Her name, he would learn later, was Mira, and she was already judging him. Headmaster Finian emerged from the main building, moving with the careful gait of a man who had long ago accepted his own limitations. He was old, not Kaelen old, but old enough, with kind eyes and a weariness that seemed to seep from his very bones. He looked at Kaelen, and for a moment something flickered in his gaze. Recognition? No, just curiosity. "Welcome to Azure Willow Academy," Finian said, his voice gentle. "I'm afraid we don't get many visitors. How can I help you?" Kaelen studied the headmaster's face, searching for traces of his old friend. They were there, the shape of the jaw, the way the eyes crinkled at the corner. This was Thuron's grandson, carrying a legacy he probably didn't fully understand. "I'm looking for a place to stay," Kaelen said simply. "I have experience with combat. I could teach if you'll have me." A ripple of reaction ran through the students. Some snickered, others rolled their eyes. Mira's expression hardened into something like contempt. "Teach," she repeated, her voice sharp. "Teach what? How to be old, how to look lost." "Mira," Finian cautioned, but there was no real heat in it. He looked at Kaelen with apologetic eyes. "I'm sorry. We're not exactly a prestigious institution. Our students have seen their share of frauds, people claiming to be experts who just wanted a warm bed and a hot meal." Kaelen nodded. He understood. Trust was earned, not given. "Then let me earn my place. A demonstration, your strongest student against me." That got their attention. Mira's eyes widened, then narrowed. "You want to fight me?" "I want you to try to hit me," Kaelen corrected. "Once. I won't move from this spot. If you land a single blow, I'll leave and never return." It was absurd. The students exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or be offended. Mira was their best. Not that best meant much at a failing academy, but she was young, fast, and trained. This old man could barely stand straight. "You'll regret this," Mira said, dropping into a combat stance. Kaelen simply stood there, hands at his sides, expression neutral. "I doubt it." Mira attacked. She was faster than he expected, not that his expectations were particularly high. Her form was sloppy, her footwork imprecise, but there was raw talent there, buried beneath years of inadequate training. She lunged forward, fist aimed at his chest, putting her entire body behind the strike. Kaelen didn't move. He didn't need to. Mira's fist passed through empty air where his chest had been, except he hadn't moved. She had. In the instant before her strike landed, some unconscious part of her brain had adjusted her trajectory, pulling the blow just enough to miss. She didn't understand it, neither did the other student. What they saw was Mira throwing a punch, and Kaelen standing perfectly still, while she stumbled past him and fell flat on her face. The courtyard went silent. Mira pushed herself up, her face red with humiliation and confusion. What? How? Kaelen looked down at her, and for the first time in decades he felt something stirring in his chest. Amusement. Genuine, warm amusement. You telegraph your intentions with your shoulders. Your opponent doesn't need to move if they know where you're going to be before you do. Mira stared at him, her embarrassment warring with dawning realization. She'd never heard anyone explain combat that way. Neither had the other students, who were now looking at Kaelen with something other than mockery. "That's enough excitement for one day," Finian interjected, though his eyes were thoughtful. "We have a spare room in the east wing. It's small, but it's dry. You're welcome to it." Kaelen inclined his head in gratitude. "Thank you, headmaster." As he followed Finian toward the living quarters, he felt Mira's eyes on his back, confused, curious, and for the first time, perhaps a little hopeful. That night the students gathered in their common room, a cramped space lit by flickering candles. The topic of discussion was inevitable. "Did you see what happened?" Ren, a quiet boy with observant eyes, spoke softly. "Mira, you didn't even get close." Mira sat in the corner, arms wrapped around her knees, her expression troubled. "I know, I've been replaying it in my head. It's like he knew what I was going to do before I did, not reacting, knowing. There's a difference." Celia, the noble's daughter who'd ended up at Azure Willow because her family couldn't afford better, sniffed dismissively. "So he's got some tricks. That doesn't mean he's actually a warrior. My father's court mage can do all sorts of parlor tricks." "Your father's court mage couldn't dodge a punch from a farm girl," Lily the healer said quietly, then blushed at her own boldness. Before anyone could respond, the world exploded. The blast shook the entire academy, sending dust raining from the ceiling and knocking candles from their holder. Through the windows, they could see flames licking at the main gate, and beyond them, torches. Dozens of torches. An army. The students rushed outside to find the courtyard filling with armed soldiers, their armor gleaming in the firelight. At their head, mounted on a massive warhorse, sat Baron Vex, a corpulent man with small, cruel eyes and the smug expression of someone who had never been told no in his entire privileged life. Beside him, looking far too pleased with himself, stood the noble's son from earlier that day. "There," the boy shouted, pointing at the academy. "That's where the old man is. He destroyed my pendant, our family's heirloom. I demand justice." Baron Vex raised a hand, and his soldiers leveled their weapons at the gathered students. "You hear that? Academy scum. You're harboring a criminal. Hand him over, and perhaps I'll only burn half your pathetic school to the ground." Headmaster Finian stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "My Lord Baron, please. There must be some misunderstanding. Our new guest is an old man, nothing more. He couldn't possibly have." "Are you calling my son a liar?" The Baron's voice dripped with menace. "The artifact was worth more than this entire ruin. You'll pay compensation or you'll pay in blood. Those are your only options." The students huddled together, fear evident on their young faces. Mira stood at the front, fists clenched, her earlier confidence completely gone. What could they do against trained soldiers, against a noble's private army? She felt a hand on her shoulder and nearly jumped out of her skin. Kaelen stood beside her, having appeared without a sound. He looked at the soldiers, at the Baron, at the terrified students, and his ancient eyes held no fear, no anger, just a deep, profound weariness, and beneath that something else. Something that made Mira's breath catch. He stepped forward, moving with that same slow, deliberate grace, until he stood between the students and the army. "Baron Vex," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard without effort. "You have a choice to make. You can take your soldiers and leave now, and this ends with no one getting hurt. Or you can stay and learn why the old stories always warned against waking sleeping dragon." For a moment there was absolute silence. Then the Baron laughed, a booming, contemptuous sound that his soldiers dutifully echoed. "Sleeping dragon," the Baron wheezed. "You're a half-dead vagrant in a crumbling ruin. Men, arrest this fool. If he resists, cut him down." The soldiers advanced. What happened next wasn't a fight, it was a lesson. The first soldier swung his sword in a wide arc, aiming for Kaelen's shoulder. Kaelen simply wasn't there when the blade arrived, not dodging, not moving, just elsewhere, as if the space he'd occupied had never contained him at all. The soldier stumbled past, off balance, and crashed into his comrade. Two more attacked simultaneously, their swords thrusting from opposite directions. Kaelen's body flowed between them like water between stone, and the soldiers found themselves entangled in each other's weapon, their own momentum working against them. A mage in the back rank hurled a firebolt, a spell that should have been impossible to avoid at this range. Kaelen raised one hand and the firebolt simply stopped. It hovered in the air for a heartbeat, then dissipated like a snuffed candle. He wasn't fighting them. He was walking through. Every swing missed. Every spell failed. Every soldier who tried to grab him ended up grabbing empty air, or worse, grabbing each other. Within minutes, the Baron's army was a tangled mess of confused, terrified men, their weapons scattered, their dignity in shambles. And Kaelen hadn't struck a single blow. He stood at the center of the chaos, untouched, unruffled, his breathing as steady as when he'd started. He looked at Baron Vex, and for the first time, something hard flickered in those ancient eyes. "Go home," Kaelen said quietly, "before I forget that I'm trying to set a good example for the children." The Baron's face had gone white. He opened his mouth to speak, found no words, and simply wheeled his horse around and fled into the night. His soldiers scrambled to follow, leaving behind their weapons, their dignity, and the noble son, who stood frozen in place, staring at Kaelen with an expression of pure terror. Kaelen looked at the boy. "You should go too, and tell your father, the next time he sends soldiers to threaten children, I won't be so gentle." The boy ran. Silence fell over the courtyard. The students stared at Kaelen as if seeing him for the first time. Mira's mouth hung open. Ren's eyes were wide. Even Finian looked stunned. Then slowly, the silence was broken by a cold wind that seemed to come from nowhere. It swept through the courtyard, carrying with it a spectral light that coalesced into shimmering symbols in the air, words, written in fire and ice simultaneously. Kaelen, DESIGNATED anomaly. You are hereby SUMMONED to the Watchers Council. Present yourself at the capital within 3 days for immediate evaluation. Noncompliance will result in immeasurable force being brought to bear upon your current location and all individuals within it. The message hung there for a long moment, then dissipated into nothing. The students turned to Kaelen with new fear in their eyes, not fear of him but fear for him. The Watchers' Council, the immortal mages who ruled from shadows. No one was summoned by them for anything good. Kaelen looked at the empty space where the message had been, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, his expression shifted, not to fear, never fear, but to something else, something that looked almost like resignation. "The Watchers' Council," he murmured. "Of course, they'd remember." Mira stepped forward, her voice unsteady but determined. "What are you going to do?" Kaelen turned to look at her, at all of them, and for just a moment the weight of 3 centuries showed on his face. "What I always do," he said quietly, "face the consequences of outliving my welcome." He walked past them toward the academy, each step heavy with a history they couldn't begin to imagine. Behind him, Mira exchanged glances with the other students, and in her eyes something had changed. Fear was still there, confusion too, but underneath both a new emotion had taken root. Loyalty to a man she'd mocked just hours ago, to a warrior who just faced down an army without lifting a finger, to someone who, for reasons she couldn't explain, felt like the only real thing in a world of shadows. Whatever the Watchers' Council wanted with Mira decided in that moment, they wouldn't face it alone. None of them would. Chapter 3. The weight of a 300-year-old oath. The road to the capital stretched before them like a scar across the countryside, wide, well-maintained and bustling with travelers who had no idea that a legend walked among them. Merchants hawked their wares from passing caravans. Knights in polished armor rode by on horses that cost more than the entire Azure Willow Academy. And everywhere, people rushed about their daily lives completely unaware that 300 years ago, the world had nearly ended. Kaelen walked at the front of their small group, his pace steady despite his age, despite the mile. He'd left a simple ward on the academy, nothing elaborate, just enough to warn if anyone threatened it while they were gone. The students had insisted on accompanying, Mira most of all. You don't even know what they want, she'd argued when he tried to refuse. What if they try to arrest you? What if they try to kill you? You need people watching your back. Kaelen had almost smiled at that. Almost. And you think you can protect me from the Watchers' Council? No, Mira had admitted, her chin lifting with that familiar defiance. But I can make sure you don't die alone. That had settled it, not because Kaelen needed protection, but because he understood something Mira didn't yet know about herself. She needed to come, needed to see, needed to understand what she was training to become. Now, 5 days into their journey, the capital's spires finally pierced the horizon. The students gasped. Even Celia, who'd grown up in noble houses, seemed impressed. The city was immense, a sprawling metropolis of white stone and golden towers, surrounded by walls so thick they could have withstood a siege from the Demon King himself. Beautiful, isn't it? Ren murmured, his quiet voice filled with wonder. Kaelen said nothing. He remembered when this city was a refugee camp, when these walls were being hastily erected by terrified farmers who'd never held a hammer before, when the golden towers were wooden watchtowers manned by boys who'd become men in a single bloody afternoon. Beauty was a matter of perspective. The Watchers' Council didn't reside in the royal palace or any of the grand buildings that dominated the city center. Their stronghold was older than the city itself, a massive structure carved into the mountain that loomed behind the capital, its entrance a gaping maw of dark stone that seemed to swallow light itself. Guards flanked the entrance, but they didn't stop Kaelen, didn't even look at him. They simply stepped aside as if they'd been expecting him, their faces carefully blank. The interior was nothing like the students expected. No torches, no candles. Instead, the walls themselves glowed with a soft, pulsing light that seemed to breathe with the mountain. Corridors branched in impossible directions, defying geometry, and everywhere there were eyes, carvings, paintings, statues, all watching. "This place is wrong," Lily whispered, her healer's instincts clearly on edge. "The energy here, it's too old, too still." Kaelen nodded. "The Watchers have been here since before the First Kingdom, before the First Language, before humans could write down their own history. This place remembers everything." They emerged into a circular chamber dominated by 7 thrones, each carved from a different material, one of living wood, one of crystallized light, one of darkness so deep it hurt to look at. And on those thrones sat 7 figures who had guided humanity since before humanity could guide itself. The Watchers' Council. Kaelen recognized them, not their faces, those changed over millennia, but their presence, their weight, the way reality itself seemed to bend slightly in their vicinity, as if acknowledging something greater than itself. The eldest spoke first. She was an elf, her features timeless and terrible in their beauty, her hair silver-white and flowing like water. Seraphine. She'd been there during the Demon War. She'd watched Kaelen fall. "Kaelen," she said, and her voice was like wind through ancient forests. "It has been too long." The students pressed together behind him, their bravado evaporating in the presence of beings who made them feel like mayflies. Mira tried to step forward to stand beside Kaelen, but her legs wouldn't move, literally wouldn't move. The air itself seemed to hold her in place. "Let them go," Kaelen said quietly. "They're children, they have no part in this." Seraphine's lips curved slightly. "They chose to accompany you. That gives them a part, but very well." She waved one elegant hand and the pressure lifted. The students gasped, able to move again. Another council member spoke, a being of pure light whose form shifted constantly, never settling on a single shape. "You've been gone a long time, General. The world has changed." "I see that," Kaelen replied. "The question is why you summoned me. I'm no threat to your rule. I want nothing from this world except to teach a handful of forgotten children and live out my remaining days in peace." "Peace," Seraphine, and something like sadness flickered in her ancient eyes. "You've earned peace, Kaelen, more than anyone, but peace isn't what we have to offer." She rose from her throne and descended to stand before him. Up close, the weight of her years was crushing, not physically, but spiritually, as if standing next to her meant standing next to every moment she'd ever lived. "Do you remember the end of the war?" she asked. "The final battle." Kaelen's jaw tightened. "Every moment." "Then you remember what you did, what you had to do." He remembered. Gods, he remembered. The Demon King had been unstoppable, a force of pure destruction that fed on the souls of the fallen. Armies had broken against him. Heroes had died screaming. and in the end there was only one option left. A seal. A prison that required a living anchor, someone to exist forever in the space between life and death, holding the Demon King in place with their own soul. Kaelen had volunteered, of course he had. It was the only choice that made sense. The seal held for 300 years, Seraphine continued. Longer than we dared hope, but 3 months ago it began to crack. Kaelen's eyes narrowed. The seal doesn't crack, not unless something feeds it power from the other side, Seraphine confirmed. The Demon King isn't trying to escape Kaelen, not anymore. He's trying to pull you back in, to destroy you completely, so the seal collapses and he can emerge into a world that's forgotten how to fight him. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Behind Kaelen, Mira felt her heart stop. Pull him back in, destroy him completely. This wasn't about a council evaluation. This was about, why are you telling me this? Kaelen's voice was flat, controlled. You could have let me live out my days in ignorance. Let the seal fail and deal with the consequences then. Why warn me? Seraphine's expression shifted, and for just a moment the immortal mask slipped. Beneath it was something raw, something human. Because we failed you once, she whispered. We let you sacrifice yourself while we sat in safety and called it necessary. We told ourselves it was the only way, that the greater good demanded it, and we've carried that guilt for 300 years. She reached out and placed a hand on Kaelen's chest, right where the seal's energy would be strongest. You deserve to know what's coming. You deserve the chance to fight. And these children, she glanced at the students, they deserve to know what they're training for, what they might have to face. Kaelen stood motionless, absorbing her words. 3 centuries of peace, shattered in a single conversation. The Demon King wasn't a memory. He was a present danger, reaching across the seal, trying to finish what he'd started. The seal is failing, Kaelen said slowly. How long? Months, perhaps weeks. The more you train, the more you use your power, the faster he can find you. Every lesson you teach, every technique you demonstrate, it's like a beacon, calling him closer. Mira couldn't stay silent any longer. Then what's he supposed to do? Just stop. Let himself get weak so the Demon King can't find him. That's the choice he faces. Another council member interrupted. Fight and accelerate the inevitable, or hide and hope we find another solution. Neither is good. Neither guarantees survival. Kaelen turned to look at his students. At Mira's furious tears, at Ren's pale face, at Lily's trembling hands, at Celia's dawning horror. They'd come here to support him, and instead they'd learned that their teacher was a walking time bomb. I need a moment, Kaelen said quietly. With them alone. Seraphine nodded, and the council withdrew, not physically, but their attention shifted, giving the small group a bubble of privacy in the vast chamber. Kaelen faced his student. 7 young faces, full of fear and confusion and stubborn, foolish loyalty, just like the recruits he'd led into battle 3 centuries ago. You heard her, he said. Training with me is dangerous. Not because I'll hurt you, but because he'll notice you, target you, use you to get to me. If you want to leave to go back to the academy and pretend you never met me, I understand. No shame, no judgment. Mira stepped forward, then Ren, then Lily, then Celia, then the others one by one until all 7 stood before him. You're an idiot, Mira said, her voice thick with emotion. You think we care about danger. We're Azure Willow students. We're nothing. We're the rejects and the failures and the ones nobody wanted. And you came to our crumbling school and treated us like we mattered, like we could be something. She punched him in the arm, a weak, trembling blow that carried no force. So no, we're not leaving. If the Demon King wants to come for you, he's going to have to go through us first, and we're going to make him regret it. Kaelen looked at them, really looked at them, and for the first time in 3 centuries he felt something crack inside him. Not the seal, something else. Something he'd thought long dead. Hoping. You're all idiots, he said softly. The biggest idiots I've ever met. Mira grinned through her tears. Takes one to know one. A sound interrupted them, a chime deep and resonant echoing through the chamber. The council was returning, their attention focusing once more, but Seraphine's expression had changed. Something had happened. Kaelen, she said urgently, the seal, it just... She didn't finish, because behind them in the center of the chamber a rift tore open, not large, barely the size of a doorway, but from it poured a cold that had nothing to do with temperature, a wrongness, a presence. and a voice dripping with centuries of hatred. "Hello, old friend. Did you think I'd forgotten you?" The students screamed. The council members rose from their thrones, magic flaring, but Kaelen stood frozen, staring into the rift, at the single eye that gazed back at him from the darkness. The Demon King wasn't trying to escape. He was already here, just waiting for the perfect moment to destroy everything Kaelen had built. Waiting for this. The rift snapped shut, but the damage was done. The students huddled together, their newfound courage shattered by that single glimpse of truth. And Kaelen felt the seal inside him pulse with dark energy, felt the Demon King's attention like a physical weight, felt the countdown begin. He turned to the council, his ancient face set in lines of grim determination. "How long do we really have?" Seraphine's voice was barely a whisper. "Days, maybe less. He's found you. He knows where you are. He knows who you are protecting." Kaelen looked at his students, at Mira's trembling defiance, at Ren's shaking hands, at all of them trying so hard to be brave. And he made his choice. "Then we go back, we train harder, we get ready." His voice hardened into the tone that had once commanded armies. "The Demon King wants a war. Fine, we'll give him one. But this time, he's not fighting a lone general with nothing left to lose." He put a hand on Mira's shoulder, the same gentle touch that had shattered an artifact days ago. "This time, he's fighting all of us." Mira looked up at him, and in her eyes, he saw something that made his ancient heart ache. She believed him, they all did. And for the first time in 300 years, Kaelen believed it too. Chapter 4: The Council That Remembers. The journey back to Azure Willow Academy passed in a blur of strained silence and unspoken. The students walked close together, their shoulders brushing, as if physical proximity could ward off the darkness they'd glimpsed in that council chamber. Mira kept glancing at Kaelen, at the set of his jaw, the weight in his steps, the way his ancient eyes seemed to look through the world rather than at it. He hadn't spoken since they left the capital, not one word. The academy greeted them with its usual crumbling dignity, the cracked stones, the patched dummies, the faded sign that had somehow become precious to them all. But everything felt different now. The walls that had seemed like a refuge felt like a target. The quiet valley felt like a trap. Kaelen stopped at the gate and finally turned to face them. "Sleep," he said. "Eat, rest. Tomorrow everything changes." He walked past them into the academy without another word, leaving 7 confused students standing in the twilight. Mira wanted to follow him, wanted to demand answers, explanations, something. But Ren's hand on her arm stopped her. "Let him be," the quiet boy said. "He's processing. Whatever happened in that council chamber, whatever that thing was that looked at us, he's carrying it alone because that's what he's always done. Give him tonight. Tomorrow we make sure he knows he doesn't have to anymore." Mira wanted to argue, but Ren's eyes, usually so observant and calm, held a depth of understanding that made her pause. She nodded. Tomorrow, dawn came slowly to the valley, creeping over the mountains like a reluctant witness. The students gathered in the training yard before the sun fully cleared the horizon, drawn by something they couldn't name. Instinct, perhaps, or the unconscious acknowledgement that their lives had shifted onto a new path. Kaelen was already there. He stood in the center of the yard, stripped of his worn traveling clothes, wearing simple training garb that revealed the full extent of his scars. They crisscrossed his body like a map of wars long forgotten, some thin and pale, others thick and puckered, a few that wrapped entirely around his torso as if something had tried to cut him in half. In the pale dawn light, he looked less like a man and more like a testament to survival. He waited until all 7 students stood before him, then spoke. "The Demon King knows I'm here. He knows you're here. In the coming days, he will send things to test us, to test me, to test you, to test whether this pathetic academy and its pathetic students are worth his attention." His voice carried no contempt, only fact. "He will send shadows and nightmares and creatures that have been feeding on human fear since before your ancestors learned to walk upright. And when he's satisfied that we're a threat, he will come himself." Mira swallowed hard but kept her chin up. Beside her, Ren's face had gone pale but determined. Lily trembled openly but didn't look away. Celia's noble composure cracked just slightly at the edges. The others, farm children, orphans, rejects, stood frozen in various states of terror. "So here's the truth," Kaelen continued. "In 300 years of war, I never found a way to make someone brave. Courage isn't taught. It's chosen, in the moment when everything inside you screams to run. What I can teach you is how to survive long enough to make that choice. He raised one scarred hand. Starting today, everything you thought you knew about combat is wrong. Forget techniques. Forget forms. Forget the pretty dances they teach in noble academies. In a real fight against a real enemy, those things will get you killed. His hand dropped. You're going to learn to feel. The first week was hell. Kaelen blindfolded all of them for hours at a time, while he walked silently through their midst and tapped them unexpectedly, on the shoulder, the back of the head, the ribs. The goal, he explained, was to sense attacks before they landed, to feel the displacement of air, the shift in pressure, the intention behind a strike. Mira failed spectacularly. She'd always relied on her eyes, her speed, her ability to see an opening and exploit it. Blind, she was lost. Kaelen tapped her 17 times in the first hour alone, each tap a silent judgment. Ren surprisingly excelled. His quiet nature, his habit of observing rather than participating, translated perfectly to this new skill. By the third day, he could dodge Kaelen's taps 9 times out of 10, blindfolded, silent, completely in the dark. How? Mira demanded during a water break, frustration bleeding into her voice. Ren shrugged. I'm not trying to see, I'm trying to feel. It's like when you know someone's behind you without looking. Everyone has that instinct. He's just teaching us to trust it. Mira growled and pulled her blindfold back on. The second week, Kaelen introduced exhaustion training. They sparred for hours without rest, their muscles burning, their lungs heaving, their vision swimming. Then when they could barely stand, Kaelen would attack, not hard enough to injure but hard enough to hurt. A strike here, a throw there, always followed by the same quiet instruction. Again, you don't get to stop just because you're tired. Your enemy won't. Lily collapsed on the 5th day, her slight frame finally giving out. She lay in the dirt, sobbing with exhaustion and frustration, unable to rise. Kaelen knelt beside her. What hurts? Everything, Lily gasped. I can't do this. I'm a healer, not a fighter. I shouldn't be here. Kaelen was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. In the demon war, our best healers died first. Not because they were weak, because they were kind. They'd run into danger to save the wounded, and the enemy learned to target them. We lost 100 healers before we figured out how to train them differently. He helped Lily sit up, his ancient eyes holding hers. A healer who can't defend herself is a liability. A healer who can defend herself is a miracle. You're not here to become a warrior. You're here to become the kind of healer who can save someone while a demon is trying to rip her throat out. That's harder than anything Mira will learn, but I think you can do it. Lily stared at him, tears still streaming down her face. Then slowly she nodded. She got back up. By the 3rd week, something had shifted. The students moved differently now, more quietly, more attentively, more aware. They caught each other's eyes during training and understood without words. They anticipated Kaelen's lessons before he announced them. They'd begun to function not as 7 individuals, but as something closer to a single organism. Mira discovered that her speed, combined with this new sensitivity, made her devastating. She could flow through opponents now, striking and retreating before they knew she'd move. Ren became their eyes, literally. His ability to sense threats extended to the group. He'd call out dangers before anyone else noticed, directing them with quiet precision. Lily found her healing magic transforming, where before she could only mend wounds, now she could strengthen, reinforcing muscles, sharpening senses, pushing back fatigue. In the middle of a brutal sparring session, she laid hands on Mira and suddenly everything clicked. Mira moved faster, hit harder, thought clearer. Is this what you meant? Lily gasped, exhausted from the effort. Kaelen, watching from the sideline, allowed himself the smallest nod. And Celia, proud, noble Celia, who'd come to this academy because her family couldn't afford better, found her purpose in strategy. She'd always had a mind for tactics, but she'd never known how to apply it. Now, watching Kaelen's lessons, she began to see the pattern. The way attacks could be layered, the way defenses could be baited, the way a small group could fight like a much larger one through coordination alone. You're seeing it, Kaelen said to her one evening, as the others collapsed in exhaustion. The battlefield as a living thing. Celia nodded slowly. It's like music. Each fighter is an instrument. Alone, they're just noise. Together, they can be a symphony. Kaelin's eyes gleamed with something that might have been pride. Thuron used to say that. Your grandfather's grandfather. He was the only tactician I ever met who could make an army sing. Celia's breath caught. She'd heard stories of her famous ancestor, of course, everyone had. But to hear Kaelen speak of him, to hear that personal connection, made it real in a way it never had been. What was he like, she whispered, really like? Kaelen looked toward the mountains, toward memories 3 centuries old. He laughed when he should have cried. He cried when he should have laughed. He trusted people until they gave him reason not to, and even then he'd give them second chances, third chances. He believed in the good in everyone, and somehow, impossibly, that belief made people want to be good. He turned back to Celia. You have his eyes, and from what I've seen you have his mind. He would be proud of you. Celia said nothing. She couldn't. The tears in her throat wouldn't let her. The night training exercise came at the end of the 4th week. Kaelen led them into the forbidden forest, a sprawling woodland at the valley's edge that local legend claimed was haunted. The students had always avoided it, their fears fed by generations of warning. But Kaelen walked into its depths without hesitation, and they followed. The forest was dark, not the normal dark of night under trees, but something deeper, a quality of shadow that seemed to swallow light before it could touch the ground. The students stayed close together, their training keeping them aware of each other's positions even when they couldn't see. This is a perception exercise, Kaelen said quietly. There are things in this forest, old things. They won't hurt you if you don't hurt them. Your task is to move through without being noticed. Feel them before they feel you. Adjust. Adapt. He melted into the darkness, leaving them alone. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Mira took a breath and stepped forward. The others followed. They moved like shadows themselves now, silent, watchful, attuned. Ren's senses extended outward, feeling for the presences Kaelen had mentioned. He found them, dozens of them, old and patient and utterly still. They passed the first without incident, the second, the third. Then Lily stumbled. It was nothing, a root she didn't see, a misstep in the darkness. But the sound was enough. One of the presences stirred, turned, looked at them, and ran. Not toward them, past them. A blur of motion that made Mira's hair stand on end. Before anyone could react, it was gone, disappearing deeper into the forest. What was that? Celia hissed. I don't know, Ren whispered, his face pale. But there's something ahead, something wrong. They pressed forward, drawn by curiosity and the terrible certainty that they needed to see. The forest opened into a clearing, and there, illuminated by moonlight that shouldn't have reached this deep, lay a soldier. He was dying. That much was obvious from the moment they saw him. His armor was ancient, a style none of them recognized, and emblazoned on his chest was an insignia that made Kaelen's blood run cold when he materialized from the shadows behind them. Step back, Kaelen ordered, his voice tight. Don't touch him. The soldier's eyes fluttered open, eyes that held the glazed, distant look of someone already halfway to the afterlife. He saw Kaelen, and something like recognition flickered across his ravaged features. General, he whispered, you're still alive. Kaelen knelt, his ancient face carved from stone. Who sent you? The soldier's hand twitched toward his chest, toward that terrible insignia. He knows, the master. He knows you're training them. He's been watching, waiting. He wanted to strike before you were ready, but the seal still holds some power. So he sent something else, something to slow you down. The soldier's eyes found the student, young faces frozen in horror. Forgive me, he whispered. I couldn't stop it, I couldn't. His eyes went still. The light behind them faded to nothing. Kaelen stood slowly, his expression unreadable. The students pressed together, fear radiating from them in waves. What did he mean? Mira demanded. What did he send? Kaelen, what did he send? Kaelen turned to face them, and for the first time since they'd known him, they saw something in his eyes that looked almost like fear. Something that doesn't need to breach the seal, he said quietly. Something that's been sleeping in this world since the war ended, waiting for its master's call. A shade, a fragment of the Demon King's consciousness, given form and purpose. The temperature dropped, the moonlight flickered, and from the depths of the forest something answered. Not a roar, not a scream, just a whisper, a single word carried on a wind that shouldn't exist. Kaelen. The students ran. They didn't think about it, didn't plan it. Their bodies simply reacted, propelling them toward the academy, toward light, toward away. But Mira, halfway through the forest, stopped. Kaelen hadn't followed. She turned, heart pounding, and saw him standing in the clearing, facing the darkness alone. His posture was calm, ready, but she'd spent weeks training with him, watching him, learning his every micro-expression. And she saw it. He was afraid. Not for himself, for them. Mira's feet carried her back before her brain could catch up. She burst into the clearing just as the shadows coalesced into form, a shape that was and wasn't there, darkness given terrible substance, with eyes that held all the emptiness of the void between stars. The shade looked at Kaelen, looked at her, and smiled. "Little lamb," it whispered, "come to watch the shepherd fall." Kaelen's voice cut through the night like a blade. "Mira, get behind me, now." But Mira couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shade's eyes held her, and in them she saw visions, her own death 1,000 times over, her friends broken and bleeding, the academy burned to ash, everything she'd come to love destroyed because she wasn't strong enough to protect it. "Is it kindness?" the shade murmured, its voice sliding into her mind like poison, "to train them for a slaughter? Or is it selfishness? Because he can't bear to be alone." The words weren't meant for her. They were meant for Kaelen. Mira understood that distantly through the fog of terror. The shade was attacking him through her, using her fear as a weapon. And she saw it work. Kaelen's hand trembled, actually trembled, the hand that had faced down armies, that had sealed away a god, that had never once shown weakness in all the weeks she'd known him. It shook just slightly as he raised it to banish the creature. The shade laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You know I'm right, old soldier. Every moment they spend with you is a moment closer to death. Every lesson you teach is a lesson in how to die. You're not saving them, you're using them, because after 300 years alone, you'd rather watch children burn than face the darkness by yourself." Kaelen's hand stopped mid-motion. His ancient eyes, usually so steady, flickered with something Mira had never seen there. Doubt. The shade pressed its advantage, stepping closer, its form expanding to envelop them both. "Look at her. So brave, so foolish. She thinks you're a hero. She doesn't know that heroes are just corpses who haven't fallen yet. She doesn't know that everyone you've ever loved has died screaming your name." Mira couldn't move, couldn't speak, but something in her, something that had been growing since the moment this strange, scarred old man walked into their crumbling academy, refused to accept what she was hearing. This wasn't Kaelen. This wasn't the man who'd faced down an army without striking a blow. This wasn't the teacher who'd knelt beside Lily in the dirt and told her she could be a miracle. This was a shadow of him, a twisted reflection, and the thing in front of her was feeding on. She found her voice. Not loud, not brave, just hers. "Leave him alone." The shade's attention shifted, surprised. "Little lamb speaks." Mira's legs were shaking. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. But she stepped forward anyway, one step, then another, until she stood between Kaelen and the creature. "I said leave him alone." Her voice grew stronger. "You don't know him. You don't know what he's done for us. You don't know that he came to our pathetic school and treated us like we mattered when no one else in the world would give us a second glance." She picked up a branch from the ground, a pathetic weapon against a creature of shadow, and pointed it at the shade. "He's ours now, and you don't get to take him." For a single, eternal moment, everything froze. Then Mira charged. It was suicide. She knew it was suicide. The shade was ancient power given form, and she was a farm girl with a stick. But she couldn't stand there and watch Kaelen break. Couldn't let that thing win. She was 3 steps from the creature when she heard them, footsteps pounding through the forest. Ren, his quiet face set in grim determination. Lily, her healing magic already flaring. Celia, her tactical mind calculating 100 impossible angles. And behind them the others, every single student from the academy, armed with branches and rocks and sheer, stupid courage. They formed a ragged line beside her, their training taking over despite their terror. Ren's perception expanded, calling out the shade's movements before they happened. Lily's magic surged, strengthening them all, pushing back fear and exhaustion. Celia's voice rang out, coordinating, directing, turning a mob into something that almost resembled a formation. "Left side, Mira, now. Ren, cover the rear. Lily, keep the magic flowing." The shade hesitated. In all its centuries of existence, it had never seen anything like this. 7 children, armed with sticks, standing against a fragment of their master's will, not because they thought they could win, because they refused to let it touch their teacher. That hesitation lasted 1 second. It was enough. Kaelen moved, really moved, for the first time since the students had known him. He crossed the distance in an instant, placing himself between the shade and his students. His hand, no longer trembling, pressed against the creature's core. "You want to know what you're wrong about," he said quietly. "You think I'm using them. You think they're victims waiting to happen. But look at them. Really look." The shade looked. 7 children, terrified, exhausted, armed with sticks, standing together. "They chose this," Kaelen continued. "Not because I asked them to, not because I manipulated them, because they're good, kinder than I ever was, braver than I ever was. And you know what? You're right about one thing, I couldn't bear to be alone anymore, but I'm not using them, they're saving me. They just don't know it yet." The shade tried to pull back to escape, but Kaelen's grip held. His eyes blazed with an energy that made the creature scream, not with pain, but with recognition. "You want to destroy me," Kaelen whispered. "Then destroy this." He pulled. The shade's form unraveled, streaming into Kaelen's body like smoke into a void. It fought, it screamed, it clawed at his soul. But Kaelen had spent 300 years holding something infinitely worse. This fragment was nothing. The last of the shade vanished with a shriek that echoed through the forest and faded into silence. Kaelen stood in the center of the clearing, his body rigid, his eyes closed. Energy crackled around him, dark and light intertwined, fighting for dominance. The students watched in horror, unable to help, unable to move. Then slowly, his eyes opened. They were still his eyes, still ancient, still weary, still Kaelen. But beneath them, for just a moment, something else flickered. Something dark, something hungry. It vanished before anyone could be sure they'd seen it. Kaelen took a breath, a long, slow, deliberate breath, and turned to face his student. "That," he said, his voice rough, "is why we train. Because when the moment comes, you don't have time to think. You only have time to be. And tonight, you were magnificent." Mira burst into tears. She didn't mean to. She fought it, tried to hold it in, but the reaction was too strong. The terror, the relief, the impossible pride in what they'd just done. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing, and a moment later, she wasn't alone. Ren, Lily, Celia, all of them, crying in the moonlight, surrounded by a forest that would never quite feel the same. Kaelen knelt beside them, and for the first time he didn't stand apart. He gathered them close, his scarred arms surrounding as many as could reach, and held them while they shook. "You're okay," he murmured. "You're all okay, we're okay." They stayed like that until the tears stopped, until the shaking faded, until the first light of dawn began to creep through the tree. And in that moment, they were closer than any army Kaelen had ever commanded. Then the sound came, from the valley below, from the direction of the academy, marching, thousands of feet, moving in perfect unison, the unmistakable thunder of an army on the move. Kaelen rose, his students scrambling to their feet behind him. They rushed to the forest's edge and looked down at the valley, at the academy, at the plains beyond, at the force that had somehow materialized while they were fighting for their lives. It wasn't demon, it was human. Thousands of soldiers in black armor forming ranks with the precision of decades of practice. At their head, a single figure on horseback, a man with familiar shoulders, familiar posture, familiar presence. Kaelen's breath caught. The figure raised his visor, and even from this distance, even after 300 years, Kaelen recognized that face. Darian, his second in command, the man who was supposed to guard the seal, the brother he'd left behind when he sacrificed himself, and riding at the head of an army that shouldn't exist. The wind carried his voice across the valley, deep and resonant and achingly familiar. 300 years, old friend. Did you think I'd forgotten you? Kaelen stood frozen at the forest's edge. His students pressed close behind him, and for the first time in centuries, he had absolutely no idea what came next. Chapter 5. The lessons begin. The army filled the valley like a stain spreading across clean fabric. Thousands upon thousands of soldiers in black armor, their formations so precise they might have been drawn with a ruler. Banners snapped in the morning wind, a black field with a silver fist clutching lightning, the insignia of the Black Banner Corps. Kaelen's students pressed close behind him, their exhaustion forgotten, their terror fresh and raw. Mira's hand found his sleeve and gripped it like a lifeline. "Who?" she whispered. "Kaelen, who is that?" He didn't answer, couldn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the mounted figure at the army's head, The man who'd ridden beside him through 100 battles, who'd pulled him from the wreckage of a dozen near-deaths, who'd wept with him when Thuron fell. Darian, alive, after 3 centuries, leading an army that should have dissolved when the war ended. That's not possible, Kaelen heard himself say, though the words seemed to come from somewhere far away. He was supposed to guard the sea. He was supposed to. To what? Ren's quiet voice cut through the fog. Wait for you forever. The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. They descended from the forest slowly, each step carrying them closer to the impossible. The army watched their approach with 1,000 impassive eyes, not hostile, not welcoming, just waiting. As if they'd been waiting for centuries. The mounted figure dismounted when they were 50 paces apart and walked forward alone. Darian, older now, not in years, but in the way grief aged a man. His face was carved from the same stone as Kaelen's memories, but deeper lines bracketed his mouth now, and his eyes held shadows that hadn't been there during the war. He stopped 10 paces away and simply looked at his old commander. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Darian's lips curved into something that might have been a smile on a younger man. On him, it looked like a scar. You look terrible, he said. Kaelen's response was automatic, drawn from 100 similar exchanges in their youth. You look exactly the same, which means you haven't aged a day, which means you haven't been living, which means I've been waiting. Darian's voice cracked on the last word just slightly. 300 years, Kaelen. 300 years, and you couldn't even send a message. The students exchanged bewildered glances. This was not the reunion they'd expected. This was not an enemy. This was a brother, wounded and angry and desperately, achingly glad to see his friend alive. Kaelen closed the distance between them and gripped Darian's shoulder, the same grip he used 1,000 times before battle, before charge, before the worst moments of their shared history. I didn't know, he said quietly. The seal. I was aware but not awake, not really. I couldn't reach out, couldn't see, couldn't do anything except exist and wait. Darian's composure shattered. Just for a moment, a flicker of anguish across those ancient features, before he forced it back behind the mask of command. I know, he said roughly. I know. That's the only reason I'm not killing you right now. He pulled away and looked past Kaelen at the students. 7 frightened young faces, trying so hard to be brave. These are your new soldiers. Something bitter entered his voice. Children, you're training children. They're my students, Kaelen corrected, and they just helped me destroy a shade. What have your soldiers done lately? Darian's eyebrows rose. A shade here. His eyes swept the valley, the forest, the sky, searching for threats that might still linger. The seal is holding, barely. The shade was a fragment, nothing more, but it means he knows. The Demon King knows I'm here, knows what I'm doing. He'll send more. Darian was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned and gestured toward his army. We should talk, alone, He paused, searching for the right word. Students can wait with my corps, they'll be safe. Mira stepped forward before Kaelen could respond. No, whatever you have to say to him, you can say to us. We're not leaving. Darian looked at her, really looked, with the assessing gaze of a man who'd spent centuries judging warrior, and something like respect flickered in his eyes. Stubborn, he observed, foolish, loyal. He glanced at Kaelen. You always did attract that type. Kaelen almost smiled. They're worse than you were. Impossible. But Darian's tone had softened. He nodded toward the army. Fine, bring them. But if they faint from boredom while we discuss ancient history, don't blame me. The command tent was massive, large enough to hold 100 soldiers, though only a handful of Darian's officers occupied it now. Maps covered every surface, detailing terrain Kaelen recognized and some he didn't. The world had changed in 3 centuries, and someone had been paying attention. Darian dismissed his officers with a gesture and turned to face Kaelen and his 7 students. For a long moment, he simply looked at them, at the old general who should have been dead, at the children who followed him, at the impossible situation they all found themselves in. After the war, Darian began, his voice heavy with memory, after you sealed yourself away, everything fell apart. Not immediately. At first there was peace, real peace. People celebrated, rebuilt, had children who'd never know the sound of demon war cries. He moved to a map of the kingdom, pointing to locations they all recognized. But the Watcher's Council, his jaw tightened. They decided the best way to protect the peace was to erase the war from memory. They sealed the history, burned the records, told the next generation that the demons were just stories, that the heroes were just legends, that there was nothing to fear. Celia, the noble's daughter, frowned. But everyone knows about the demon war. It's in every history book. Is it? Darian's smile held no warmth. Open any history text. How many pages are devoted to the war? How many names do you remember besides the generals? How many battles can you name? Celia opened her mouth, then closed it. She couldn't. None of them could. The war became a fairy tale, Darian continued. A story to frighten children into obedience. The real details, the real sacrifices, the real horror all erased. And the heroes, he looked at Kaelen, they became names in a book, nothing more. Kaelen absorbed this in silence. He'd suspected as much. The students' ignorance of basic combat, their complete lack of historical context, it all made sense now. I watched them die, Darian whispered. All of them, one by one. Thuron's children, then their children, then their children's children. I watched them grow old and gray and forget that their grandfather had saved the world. I watched them forget you. His voice cracked again. And I couldn't do anything, couldn't tell them, couldn't make them remember, because the council's seal wasn't just on the records, it was on us. Anyone who tried to speak the truth found their words turning to ash in their mouths. Mira's hand found Kaelen's sleeve again. She didn't know what to say. None of them did. So I waited, Darian said. I kept the core together, told them we were mercenaries, told them we'd fight for coin, told them whatever lies they needed to hear to stay. And I watched. I waited for the seal to break, for you to return, for something to change. He stepped closer to Kaelen, close enough to touch. And then 3 months ago I felt it, the seal shifting, you waking up. I gathered the core and marched. It took me this long to find you because, he hesitated, because someone's been trying to stop me. The tent went quiet. What do you mean? Kaelen asked. Darian's expression darkened. Baron Vex. His attack on your academy wasn't random. He was following orders from someone in the capital who doesn't want you training an army, someone who's been feeding information to the Demon King's agents for years. The words landed like stones in still water. Celia gasped. Ren's face went pale. Mira's grip on Kaelen's sleeve tightened until her knuckles went white. Someone in the capital, Kaelen repeated. On the council. I don't know, maybe. The trail leads everywhere and nowhere. But I know this. The moment you started training these children, the attacks began. The shade didn't find you by accident. It was guided. Darian reached into his armor and withdrew a worn leather journal, ancient, battered, held together by nothing but memories. He held it out to Kaelen. My war diary, he said quietly. From the last days of the war. I've kept it with me every day since you fell. Read the last entry, the one I wrote after. He didn't finish, didn't need to. Kaelen took the journal, his scarred hands gentle on its fragile pages. The students watched in silence as he opened it, as his eyes found the final entry, as his expression shifted from curiosity to confusion, to something that looked almost like horror. What is it? Mira demanded. Kaelen, what does it say? Kaelen didn't answer. He kept reading, his face growing paler with each word. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a pain none of them had ever seen there before. Darian, he said slowly, this is a death warrant, my death warrant. Darian met his gaze without flinching. Read it aloud. They deserve to know. Kaelen's voice, when it came, was rough as gravel. I've spent months researching the seal, how it works, how it might be broken, and I've found something terrible, a forbidden ritual that could free Kaelen without releasing the Demon King. But the ritual requires a sacrifice, a soul exchange, someone willing to take his place in the seal. He paused, his eyes scanning ahead. I've also discovered that the seal isn't just a prison, it's a connection. Whoever holds it is linked to the Demon King on a fundamental level. And if that connection is severed violently, if the anchor is destroyed rather than replaced, the backlash will annihilate everything within 1,000 miles. Mira's hand flew to her mouth. Ren looked physically ill. The others stared in frozen horror. Kaelen read the final lines. There's only one way to ensure the seal holds forever, one way to guarantee the Demon King never escapes. The anchor must be willing to die, truly die, while the seal is at full strength. The backlash would be contained, focused only on the anchor. The kingdom would be safe, but Kaelen would be gone forever. I've written this down because I need to remember. I need to remember that I'm willing to do it, willing to take his place, to die in his stead, to give him the peace he's earned. But I also need to remember that he'll never agree. He'll never let me sacrifice myself for him. So I'll wait, I'll watch. And when the time comes, I'll make the choice for both of us. The tent was absolutely silent. Kaelen closed the journal and looked at his oldest friend, at the man who'd carried this weight for 3 centuries, who'd kept an army together, who'd marched across the kingdom with a single purpose. "You were going to take my place," Kaelen whispered. "You were going to die for me." Darian's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down his weathered face, and he didn't wipe them away. "I was going to give you the peace you deserve," he said hoarsely. 300 years in that void, Kaelen. 300 years of nothing. You think I could let you go back to that? You think I could watch you suffer for another century while I stood by and did nothing?" He grabbed Kaelen's shoulders, the same grip Kaelen had used on him, reversed now, desperate and fierce. "I've lived 300 years waiting for this moment, waiting to see your face again. And now that you're here, now that I have to look at you and know what you've been through, do you think I can just let it continue? Let you go back to being the anchor while I walk free?" Kaelen stared at his friend, his brother, and for the first time since emerging from the seal, he had no words, no wisdom, no comfort. The students watched the 2 ancient warriors, their own struggles suddenly feeling very small. Then Mira stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I'm sorry, I know this is really emotional and everything, but I have a question." Darian looked at her, startled out of his grief. "What?" "All that stuff about soul exchanges and dying and taking his place. Why does it have to be one person? Why can't it be all of us?" The tent went silent again, but this silence was different, charged, expectant. Mira pressed on, her words tumbling out faster. "You said the seal needs an anchor, right? One soul to hold it in place. But you also said the seal connects to the Demon King, and if the anchor dies, everything explodes. So the problem is that all the weight is on one person suffering alone, one person dying alone." She looked at Kaelen, at Darian, at her fellow students. "But what if it wasn't one person? What if it was 100, 1,000? What if the weight was spread out so no one had to carry it alone?" Darian stared at her like she'd grown a second head. Then slowly, his eyes widened. That's not how the ritual was designed. The original seal required a single anchor because it was forged in desperation with limited resources. But in theory," he looked at Kaelen, "in theory, a collective anchor could work, if the souls were bound together tightly, if they shared the burden equally." Kaelen's ancient eyes, still wet with unshed tears, slowly turned toward his student. 7 young faces, 7 pairs of eyes, scared but determined, 7 hearts that had already proven themselves braver than armies. "You're suggesting," he said carefully, "that we train them to share my burden, to become part of the seal themselves." Mira nodded. "You said we were magnificent against the shade. You said we moved like one organism. What if we learned to do that all the time? What if we learned to be your anchor together?" Kaelen looked at Darian. Darian looked back, his expression a mixture of wonder and calculation. "How many?" Kaelen asked. "How many would it take to hold the seal collectively?" Darian's mind, trained for centuries in strategy and logistics, immediately began calculating. "The seal's weight is immense. It was designed for one soul, a powerful one but still just one. Spreading it out reduces the burden on each individual but increases the complexity of the binding. The souls would need to be perfectly synchronized, perfectly united." He paused, doing mental math. 100, maybe less if they're trained specifically for unity, if they're bound by something stronger than duty. Kaelen turned back to his students. 7 of them, 7 souls who'd already proven they'd die for each other. "We have 7, he said quietly. Darian shook his head. 7 isn't enough. The weight would crush them. "Then we get more." Mira's voice was fierce. "We train more. We find more people who believe in him, who believe in us, who want to fight. The Academy's been failing for years because no one believed in it. Now we have a reason to believe. Now we have him." She pointed at Kaelen. "He spent 300 years alone so we could live in peace. The least we can do is spend a few years training so he doesn't have to be alone anymore." Kaelen looked at her, at this fierce, foolish, wonderful girl who charged a shade with a stick, and felt something crack inside him. Not the seal, The walls he'd built around his heart 3 centuries ago when he'd said goodbye to everyone he loved. "You're all insane," he said softly. "Every single one of you." Mira grinned. "Takes one to know one." Darian watched the exchange, and slowly, impossibly, a smile spread across his ancient face. The first real smile he'd worn in centuries. "You were right," he said to Kaelen. "They're worse than we were." "Much worse," Kaelen agreed. "They have hope." The word hung in the air like a prayer. Hope. After 300 years, Kaelen finally had something worth hopping for. He looked at Darian, at his students, at the impossible future stretching before them. "Then we'd better get started." Outside the tent, the Black Banner Corps waited in perfect formation, their patience infinite after centuries of practice. Inside, 7 students and 2 ancient warriors began to plan. Maps were spread, strategies discussed, schedules drawn. The academy would need to expand, to train not just 7 but dozens, then hundreds. Darian's veterans would become instructors, passing on the real combat knowledge that had been erased from history. Kaelen would teach unity, the thing that had saved them against the shade, the thing that might save them all. And somewhere in the capital, in shadows they couldn't see, eyes watched and waited. The raven with glowing red eyes sat on a windowsill in the Watcher's tower and preened its feathers. Behind it, in a chamber lit by no natural light, a figure in dark robes studied a scrying pool that showed the valley below Azure Willow Academy. "So," the figure murmured, "the old general plans to build an army. How? Predictable." The raven cawed softly. "Send word to our contact in the noble coalition. Baron Vex failed, but he can be useful again. Tell him to gather the lesser lords, to spread fear of the academy, to make them see Kaelen as a threat to their power. Humans are so easy to manipulate when they're afraid." The raven took flight, disappearing through a window that opened onto nothing. The figure turned back to the scrying pool, watching Kaelen and his students plan their impossible future. "Train your children, old soldier. Unite your little army. It won't matter in the end. The Demon King has waited 3 centuries. He can wait a little longer." A smile curved beneath the hood, cold, satisfied, utterly without mercy. "And when you're finally ready to fight, when you've gathered everyone you love in one place, that's when he'll strike. That's when I'll deliver you all." The scrying pool went dark. In the valley below, Kaelen paused in mid-sentence, a chill running down his scarred spine. He looked toward the capital, toward the distant towers, and felt something he hadn't felt in centuries. The eyes of an enemy, watching from the dark. "Kaelen," Mira's voice broke through his unease. "You okay?" He turned back to his student, to their eager faces, their foolish courage, their stubborn hope, and made a choice. "I'm fine," he said, "just thinking about the future." Mira grinned. "Good, because we have a lot of it to plan." Kaelen allowed himself a small smile. They did, and for the first time in 300 years, that thought didn't fill him with dread. It filled him with hope. Chapter 6: The First Shadow. The weeks that followed were unlike anything the Azure Willow Academy had ever experienced. Gone was the quiet desperation of a failing institution. Gone were the empty training yards and the sense of inevitable decline. In their place, chaos. Beautiful, exhausting, transformative chaos. The Black Banner Corps moved into the valley like a returning tide, erecting tents, building temporary structures, transforming the landscape around the academy into a sprawling military encampment. Veterans who'd spent centuries waiting finally had purpose again, and they threw themselves into it with an intensity that left the young students breathless. Mira woke before dawn every day now, not because she had to, but because she couldn't bear to miss a single moment. The world had opened up before her, a world of real combat, real purpose, real meaning, and she intended to seize it with both hands. This morning, like every morning, she found Kaelen already awake. He stood at the edge of the training grounds, watching the sun paint the valley in shades of gold and amber. The same view he'd watched from the cliff, she realized, but from a different perspective now. He wasn't alone anymore. "You should be resting," she said, dropping onto the bench beside him. "Darian said you barely slept again." Kaelen didn't look at her. "Darian talks too much. He's worried about you." "We all are." Mira pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them. "The shade thing, it did something to you, didn't it? Something more than just adding to the seal." Silence stretched between them. For a moment, Mira thought he wouldn't answer. Then quietly, "The shade was part of him, part of the Demon King, Absorbing it meant absorbing some of his essence, his thoughts, his memories, his hatred. Every day I feel it a little more, whispering, testing, trying to find a way in. Mira's heart clenched. Why didn't you tell us? Because you have enough to carry. Now he did look at her, his ancient eyes holding a depth of weariness that made her want to cry. Your children. You should be worrying about exams and crushes and which academy will accept you for advanced training, not about whether your teacher is turning into a monster. Mira's response was fierce. You're not turning into a monster. You're the least monstrous person I've ever met. And we're not children, not anymore. Not after the shade. Not after everything. Kaelen studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, softened. No, he agreed quietly. You're not. A horn sounded from the camp, the signal for morning training to begin. Mira hopped up, her momentary vulnerability vanishing behind the mask of determination she'd cultivated. Come on, old man. Ren's been working on a new formation, and he'll be insufferable if we're late. Kaelen rose, slower than she did, his joints protesting the movement, but he followed. He always followed. The training grounds had been transformed. Where once 7 students had stumbled through basic forms, now dozens of soldiers moved in perfect synchronization, veterans of the Black Banner Corps, alongside raw recruits from the surrounding villages. Word had spread about the academy's resurgence, and with it came the desperate, the hopeful, the ones with nowhere else to go. Darian had been skeptical at first. Civilians, farmers, you want to turn farmers into soldiers in weeks. I want to turn them into people who can survive long enough to become soldiers, Kaelen had replied. There's a difference. Now Darian watched from the sidelines as Kaelen worked with the newest arrivals, a group of terrified teenagers who'd never held a weapon before. He didn't teach them form, didn't show them techniques. Instead, he made them close their eyes and feel. What do you sense? He asked each one, moving among them like a ghost. Not with your eyes, with your skin, your instincts. The part of you that knows when someone's watching, when danger's near, when the world shifts in ways you can't quite name. One boy, a farmer's son with calloused hands and frightened eyes, suddenly gasped. There's something behind me, moving. I can't see it, but I can feel it. Kaelen smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve of his lips, but Darian noticed. He always noticed. Good, now don't run from it. Turn toward it, greet it. Make it part of your awareness instead of something to fear. The boy turned, eyes still closed, and faced the empty space where nothing waited. But when he opened his eyes, something in his expression had changed. He stood taller, breath deeper. That was amazing, he breathed. I could feel. That was you, Kaelen said quietly. All of you. The potential has always been there. I'm just showing you how to access it. Darian watched his oldest friend work and felt something he hadn't felt in centuries. Hope. Real, genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, they could pull this off. Then Ren appeared at his elbow, his quiet voice urgent. Sir, there's something you need to see. At the eastern perimeter. The eastern perimeter was where the training exercises happened at night, the same forbidden forest where they'd encountered the shade. Now, in broad daylight, a group of veterans stood around something on the ground, their expressions grim. Darian pushed through them and stopped. A soldier lay in the grass. One of his own, a veteran who'd served for over a century. He was alive, but barely. His armor had been peeled open, as if something had clawed through metal like paper, and on his chest, burned into his skin, was a symbol that made Darian's blood run cold. The mark of the Demon King's personal guard. What happened? Darian demanded. Who did this? The wounded soldier's eyes fluttered open. Came out of nowhere, didn't look like anything, just shadow, but when it touched me, he shuddered. I saw him, Commander, the Demon King. He looked right at me and smiled. Behind Darian, Ren made a small sound of. The other veterans shifted uncomfortably. Darian knelt beside his soldier and gripped his hand. You're going to be fine. We'll get Lily, she's a healer, a good one. You'll be fine. But even as he said it, his eyes were on the mark, on the symbol that hadn't been seen in 3 centuries, on the message it carried. We're here, we're watching, and we're coming. The War Council that night was the largest yet. Kaelen, Darian, their senior officers, and, at Mira's insistence, the 7 original students crowded into the command tent, maps and reports spread across every surface. This changes things, Darian said grimly. The Demon King's personal guard were his elite, his best. If they're starting to manifest, They're not manifesting, Kaelen interrupted. Not fully. The seal still holds. What attacked your soldier was a projection, a fragment like the shade but more focused, more intentional. Intentional how? Mira asked. Kaelen met her eyes. Intentional as in, he's testing our defenses, probing for weaknesses. The soldier who was attacked was on perimeter duty, away from the main force. The Demon King is learning how we operate, how we respond, where we're vulnerable. Ren spoke up quietly. So we change how we operate, rotate patrols randomly, set up decoys, make him work for every piece of information. Darian nodded approving. Good instincts. We'll implement that immediately, but there's a bigger problem. He looked at Kaelen. If he's sending projections now, it means the seal is weakening faster than we thought. We may not have months, we may have weeks, days. The tent went silent. Mira felt the weight of those words settle on her shoulders like physical pressure. Days. They'd been training for weeks, but they weren't ready. None of them were ready. Kaelen stood slowly, his ancient face carved from stone. Then we accelerate the training, double shifts, no breaks. Everyone who can hold a weapon learns to fight as one. We don't have time for gentle instruction anymore. He looked at his students, his 7 original students, the ones who'd charged a shade with sticks. You especially, you're the core of this. The example, if you break, everyone breaks. So you won't break, understood. Mira straightened her spine, understood. The others echoed her, their voices a chorus of determination. But as the council dispersed and the planning continued into the night, Mira caught Kaelen alone at the edge of the camp, staring at the dark forest. You're scared, she said softly. It wasn't a question. He didn't deny it. I've faced the Demon King 100 times. I've never been afraid of him, but this. He gestured at the camp, at the sleeping soldiers, at the academy where 7 students dreamed of becoming heroes. This terrifies me, because if I fail, it won't just be my life. It'll be all of them, everyone who believed in me. Mira stood beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of his presence. Then don't fail, she said simply. We're not asking you to win alone anymore. We're asking you to win with us. There's a difference. Kaelen looked at her, at this fierce, impossible girl who'd become more than a student, more than a soldier, more than he'd ever expected. And for the first time in 3 centuries, he felt the weight on his shoulders lighten just slightly. When did you get so wise? He asked. Mira grinned. Always was, you just weren't paying attention. He almost laughed, almost. Then the scream tore through the night. They ran. The camp erupted into chaos. Soldiers grabbing weapons, shouting orders, forming ranks. But Kaelen and his 7 students ran toward the scream, toward the eastern perimeter, toward whatever had just announced its presence. They found chaos. The patrol stationed at the edge of the forest was gone, not dead, not wounded, just gone. Their weapons lay on the ground. Their armor sat in empty piles, but the soldiers themselves had vanished as if they'd never existed. And in their place stood a figure. It was human-shaped but wrong, too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at angles that shouldn't exist. Its skin was the color of old blood, and its eyes held the same emptiness Mira had seen in the shade, but deeper, more focused, more present. Kaelen, it said, and its voice was 1,000 whispers layered into one. The master sends his regards. It moved. Faster than anything that size should move, it crossed the distance between them and struck at Kaelen with hands that had become claws. Kaelen deflected, barely, and the force of the impact sent him staggering. Form up, Mira screamed. Now. 7 students moved as one. Ren's perception fed them information before their eyes could process it. The creature's position, its trajectory, its intent. Lily's magic surged, strengthening muscles, sharpening reflexes, pushing back fear. Celia's voice rang out, coordinating their movements, turning individual fighters into a single organism. They flowed around the creature, not attacking. They weren't ready for that, but supporting. Mira drew its attention, her speed making her a frustrating target. Ren called out its feints before they happened. The others created openings, distractions, moments of confusion that gave Kaelen space to breathe. And Kaelen fought. 3 centuries of skill unleashed in a single, devastating assault. His hands moved like weapons, each strike precise, each block perfect. The creature matched him for a moment, 2 moments, then began to falter. You cannot win, it hissed. The master sees everything, knows everything. Your little army will burn and you will watch and then—" "Shut up," Mira growled, and drove her training sword through its leg. The creature screamed, a real scream, not the layered whispers of before. It stumbled, off balance for a single heartbeat. Kaelen didn't waste the opportunity. His hand plunged into its chest and emerged clutching something dark, a core of pure shadow that pulsed with malevolent energy. He crushed it without hesitation, and the creature dissolved into smoke and silence. Silence, then cheering. The camp erupted, soldiers who'd arrived too late to fight, but in time to witness the victory, shouting and clapping and pounding each other on the back. Mira found herself lifted onto someone's shoulders, her face flushed with adrenaline and disbelief. "We did it," she kept saying. "We actually did it." Ren stood nearby, his quiet face split by a rare smile. Lily was already tending to the wounded, her healing magic flowing in gentle waves. Celia was coordinating with the officers, planning the next patrol, already thinking ahead. And Kaelen stood at the center of it all, his ancient eyes moving from student to student, soldier to soldier, face to face. And in those eyes, Mira saw something she'd never seen before. Pride. Real, genuine, overwhelming pride. She slid off the soldier's shoulders and walked to him, her heart still pounding. "We did it," she said again, quieter this time. "Together." Kaelen nodded slowly. "Together," he agreed, and then so quietly only she could hear, "Thank you." Myra's eyes stung with sudden tears. She blinked them away furiously. "Don't thank us yet," she said. "We've got a lot more fighting to do." Kaelen almost smiled. "I know." But as the celebration continued around them, as the camp slowly returned to order and the night grew quiet, Mira noticed something. Kaelen was looking at the forest again, at the darkness beyond, and his expression hadn't changed, because somewhere in that darkness something watched, something waited, something that had learned from this encounter, that would adapt, that would come again. The Demon King's personal guard had found them, and they were just the beginning. Dawn broke over the valley, painting the academy in shades of gold and amber. The camp stirred to life, soldiers resuming their training, healers tending the wounded, scouts heading out to patrol the perimeter. In the command tent, Kaelen and Darian studied maps by candlelight. 7 of them, Darian said quietly. 7 students, standing against a demon spawn that would have taken a dozen veterans to defeat. How? Kaelen didn't look up from the maps. They trust each other, completely, absolutely. They've learned to fight as one because they've learned to be one. It's not something I taught them, it's something they chose. Darian was quiet for a long moment. Then, Thuron would have loved them. Kaelen's hand stilled on the map. "Yes," he said softly, "he would have." Outside, Mira led the morning drills, her voice carrying across the training grounds. Ren worked with the newer recruits, teaching them to feel rather than see. Lily moved among the wounded, her healing magic a gentle constant. Celia coordinated with the officers, her tactical mind already planning for the next attack. They were children, they were soldiers, they were the future. And in the darkness beyond the valley, something ancient and terrible watched them all. The Demon King smiled. 7, he murmured, 7 souls burning so brightly, 7 hearts beating as one. His smile widened. Perfect. Chapter 7. The Bonds Forged in Fire. The morning after the attack brought a strange stillness to the valley. It was as if the land itself held its breath, waiting for what would come next. The soldiers moved through their drills with quiet intensity, their usual banter replaced by focused silence. Everyone could feel it, the shift in the air, the weight of knowing that the enemy had finally shown his hand. Mira found Kaelen in the same place she always did, at the edge of the training grounds, watching the sunrise. But today, he wasn't alone. Darian stood beside him, his ancient face carved from the same stone as his commander. The 2 old warriors didn't speak. They didn't need to. 3 centuries of separation couldn't erase the language they'd built together in blood and fire. Mira approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt, but Kaelen sensed her anyway, as he always did. "The scouts report movement in the eastern passes," he said without turning. "Large groups, organized." Darian nodded. "The noble coalition. Baron Vex has been busy since you humiliate. He's convinced a dozen lesser lords that the academy is a threat to their power, that you're building an army to overthrow the crown." Mira's jaw dropped. "That's ridiculous. We're training to fight demons, not—" "I know," Kaelen interrupted gently. "You know. The soldiers know. But the nobles—" He finally turned to face her, and his eyes held a weariness that made her heart ache. The nobles see what they want to see, a threat to their comfortable existence, something to fear and hate so they don't have to look at the real darkness gathering at their borders. Darian's voice was grim. They'll march within the week, maybe sooner. Vex is pushing for a quick strike. Catch us before we're ready, before the council can intervene. The council won't intervene, Kaelen said flatly. Seraphine might want to, but the others. They've spent 3 centuries convincing themselves the demon threat is over. Admitting it's real again would mean admitting they were wrong, that they've been wrong for 300 years. Mira felt anger rising in her chest, hot and fierce and utterly useless. So we fight 2 wars, one against actual demons and one against stupid nobles who can't see past their own greed. Kaelen's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Welcome to command, Mira. The enemy in front of you is rarely the only one you face. The War Council that afternoon was the largest yet. Officers from the Black Banner Corps crowded into the command tent, alongside representatives from the surrounding villages, farmers and merchants who'd thrown their lot in with the academy. And at the center of it all, 7 students who'd never expected to matter. Ren spread maps across the table, his quiet voice detailing troop movements and supply lines. The noble coalition will approach through the Eastern Valley. It's the only route that can accommodate an army of their size. If we position forces here and here, he pointed to strategic high ground, we can control the approach without committing to a full engagement. Celia nodded, her tactical mind already running through the possibility. But that assumes they take the expected route. If Vex has learned anything from his previous failures, he'll try something clever. A flanking maneuver through the forest, maybe. The forest is ours, Lily said softly. After the shade, after everything. The soldiers know that ground now. They've trained in it, slept in it, bled in it. No noble's son leading conscripted farmers knows that forest like we do. Mira listened to her friend speak, really listened, and felt something shift inside her. When had they become this? When had the scared children who'd mocked Kaelen at the gate become strategists and tacticians and leaders? Kaelen watched them too, and in his ancient eyes, Mira saw the same wonder she felt. 7 weeks, Darian murmured beside her. 7 weeks and they're already commanding councils. Your students are something else, old friend. Your soldiers helped, Kaelen replied quietly. The veteran, they gave the children something to aspire to. Darian's expression softened. They gave each other purpose. That's worth more than any training. The planning continued into the maps covered in markings, strategies debated and refined. By the time the council dispersed, they had a plan, not a perfect plan but a workable one. Defend the valley, hold the passes, give the students time to grow strong enough to share Kaelen's burden, and pray that time was enough. 3 days later, the scouts returned with news that shattered everything. The coalition army is larger than we thought, the lead scout reported, his face pale beneath its weathering. Twice as large, maybe more, and they're not alone. Kaelen's eyes narrowed. Explain. The scout swallowed hard. There are things moving with them, in their shadows, behind their ranks, things that don't belong in daylight. The soldiers don't seem to notice, but we saw them, creatures of darkness clinging to the army like parasites. The tent went silent. Darian's voice was barely a whisper. The Demon King is using the nobles as cover to move his own forces in position. Mira felt cold seep into her bone. He's not waiting for the seal to break. He's accelerating, forcing a confrontation now while we're still weak, while we're distracted. Kaelen stood slowly, his ancient face unreadable. Then we adapt. The plan changes. He moved to the map and began pointing with a certainty that brooked no argument. Mira, you'll lead the student corps in the Eastern Pass. Your job isn't to win, it's to delay. Hold them as long as you can, then fall back to the second line. Mira's heart raced. Lead, she was going to lead. Ren, you're with her. Your perception will be critical. You'll sense the demon spawn before they can ambush. Lily, you'll rotate between the lines, keeping everyone fighting. Celia, you're on overall coordination. You see the battlefield better than anyone. He continued assigning positions, his voice steady, his confidence absolute. By the time he finished, every soldier in the tent knew exactly where to be and what to do. Then he turned to Darian. You and I will hold the center. If the demons break through, if the lines collapse, we're the last stand. Darian nodded without hesitation. Where you go, I follow, always. Kaelen's eyes held his oldest friend's for a long moment. I know, that's what scares me. The night before the battle, Mira couldn't sleep. She wandered through the camp, past sleeping soldiers and quiet tents, until she found herself at the edge of the training ground. The same spot where she'd found Kaelen so many mornings. He was there now, sitting on the bench, staring at the stars. You should be resting, she said, dropping down beside him. I could say the same to you. He didn't look at her, but his voice held a warmth that made her chest tight. Nervous, terrified, she laughed softly, bitterly. I'm supposed to lead students against an army tomorrow, students who have been training for weeks, against soldiers who have been training for years, against demons who have been killing for centuries. Kaelen was quiet for a moment. Then, do you know why I chose you? Mira blinked. Chose me. I showed up at your door and refused to leave. There wasn't much choosing involved. That's where you're wrong. He turned to face her, and in the starlight his ancient eyes held a depth of feeling that stole her breath. I've seen thousands of soldiers in my lifetime. Good soldiers, brave soldiers, soldiers who followed orders and died well and were forgot. But you, he shook his head slowly. You're something else. You don't follow, you lead, you don't accept, you challenge. When everyone else saw a broken old man, you saw someone worth fighting for. Mira's eyes stung. I couldn't let you be alone, that's all. I know, Kaelen's voice was soft. That's exactly why I chose you. They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the stars wheel overhead. Then Mira asked the question that had been burning in her heart for weeks. Are we going to win? Kaelen didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was honest in a way that hurt. I don't know, the Demon King is ancient, powerful, patient. He's been planning this for 3 centuries, but he looked at her and something like hope flickered in his eyes. He's never faced anything like you, like any of you. 7 children who charged a shade with sticks. 7 hearts that beat as one. That's not something he understands. That's not something he can plan for. Mira nodded slowly. So we give him something he doesn't understand. We win by being unpredictable. We win by being together, Kaelen corrected. The demon spawn are individuals even when they serve a single master. They fight alone even when they fight in ranks. But you've learned to fight as one. That's your advantage. That's our only chance. Mira stood, her heart pounding with something that wasn't quite courage and wasn't quite fear. It was something in between, something new. Then tomorrow, she said, we show him what together looks like. Kaelen rose beside her, and for a moment they stood as equals, teacher and student, warrior and warrior, 2 people who'd found each other when they needed it most. Tomorrow, he agreed. Dawn broke bloody over the valley. The noble coalition's army filled the eastern pass like a tide of steel and flesh, thousands of soldiers marching under banners that had never known real war. And in their shadows, things moved, things that shouldn't exist, things that waited. Mira stood at the head of her students, her core now 70 strong, each one trained in the techniques Kaelen had taught. They weren't soldiers, not yet, but they were something else. They were family. The plan hasn't changed, she called out, her voice carrying across the nervous ranks. We hold the pass, we slow them down, we give Kaelen time to do what he needs to do, and when the demons show themselves, because they will, we show them what happens when you threaten our home. Ren stood at her side, his quiet presence a steady anchor. Lily moved among the ranks, her healing magic a gentle warmth. Celia coordinated from the rear, her tactical mind already processing a dozen variables. The army advanced, and Mira raised her sword. For the academy, 70 voices answered as one. The first clash was chaos. Mira had expected that, expected the confusion, the fear, the overwhelming sensory assault of battle, but she hadn't expected to understand it, to feel the flow of combat like a current, carrying her where she needed to be. Ren's perception fed her information before she knew she needed it. An attack from the left, a gap on the right, a demon spawn materializing behind the front ranks. She moved without thinking, her body responding to instincts she hadn't known she possessed. Beside her, her students fought like demons themselves, not with skill, not yet, but with unity. When one faltered, 2 others covered. When a line broke, another formed behind it. They moved as one organism, 70 hearts beating in rhythm. The noble soldiers didn't know what to do. They'd expected a rout, a quick victory against untrained children. Instead, they found something that resisted like water that flowed around their attacks, that refused to break. In the shadows, the demon spawn grew restless. Kaelen felt them before he saw them, the wrongness in the air, the weight of ancient evil pressing against the seal inside him. They were coming, not in waves but in a single focused thrust, aimed directly at the heart of his defenses. He stood in the center of the valley with Darian at his side, surrounded by the Black Banner Corps' finest veteran. Behind them, the academy waited, crumbling walls and patched dummies and 7 students who'd become more than he'd ever dreamed. "They're here," Darian murmured. Kaelen nodded. "I know." The demons emerged from the shadows like nightmares given form, tall and twisted and utterly wrong. At their head walked a figure that made even the veterans step back. It wore the shape of a man, but nothing about it was human. Its skin was pale as death, its eyes black as void, its smile wide and hungry and knowing. "Kaelen," it said, and its voice was the sound of graves opening. "The master sends his regards, and his terms." Kaelen's expression didn't change. "I don't negotiate with servants." The creature's smile widened. "Then you'll die with your little army, your precious students, your last best hope." It gestured, and behind it the demon spawn surged forward. "The master has waited 3 centuries. He can wait a little longer, but you," its eyes fixed on Kaelen with terrible intensity, "you'll watch them fall. You'll feel them die. And then, when you're alone again, when you've lost everything again, the master will come for you." Kaelen moved. 3 centuries of restraint unleashed in a single, devastating instant. He crossed the distance between them before the creature could react, his hand closing around its throat. "I've been alone for 300 years, he said quietly. "I've lost everyone I ever loved, everyone except." He looked past the creature, past the demon spawn, past the battle raging in the past. He looked at the academy, where 7 students fought and bled and used to fall. "Accept them, and I will not lose them, not today, not ever." He crushed the creature's throat and threw its body aside. "Diana with me." The Black Banner Corps roared and charged. The battle raged for hours. Mira's corps held the pass through sheer stubbornness, refusing to break even as their ranks thinned. Ren's perception guided them through every assault, every ambush, every demon spawn that tried to slip past. Lily's magic kept them fighting long after their bodies should have given out. Celia's coordination turned chaos into order, confusion into strategy. In the center, Kaelen and Darian carved through demon spawn like scythes through wheat, 2 ancient warriors fighting as one, their bond forged in a war 3 centuries past. But the enemy kept coming, always coming. Mira was on her knees, her sword arm screaming, her vision blurring when she saw it, a rift opening in the sky above the academy. Not large, not yet, but growing. And from that rift, a voice that made her blood freeze. "Kaelen, the Demon King," not manifested, not fully, but reaching through the crumbling seal, testing its strength, preparing for the final push. Mira looked at her students, her family, bleeding and exhausted and still fighting. She looked at the academy, the crumbling walls that had become home. She looked at the rift, growing larger with every heartbeat. And she made a choice. Arien, Celia, Lily to me. They came because they always came, because they were hers and she was theirs, and that was how it worked now. "We're going to the academy," she said. "Now." Ren's eyes widened. "But the pass will hold without us. The veterans know what to do, but the rift," she pointed. "That's where he's focusing, that's where we're needed." Celia's tactical mind raced through the implications. "If we're wrong, then we die, but if we're right," Mira met her eyes. "If we're right, we might just save everything." They ran. Kaelen felt them coming before he saw them. 7 familiar presences, burning bright against the darkness. He turned from the demon spawn he'd been fighting and saw his students racing toward the academy, toward the rift, toward him. "What are you doing?" he roared. "The pass is holding," Mira gasped, skidding to a stop beside him. "But that," she pointed at the rift, "that's not. He's focusing on you, Kaelen, using the seal, using your connection, trying to pull himself through. If we can reinforce the seal from this side." "You can't," Kaelen's voice was harsh. "The ritual isn't ready, the binding isn't complete. If you try now, then we die trying." Mira's chin lifted, that familiar defiance burning in her eyes. "Better than watching you die alone." Kaelen stared at her, at all of them, and felt something crack inside him. Not the seal, something else. Something that had been frozen for 3 centuries. Love. Terrifying, overwhelming, absolutely devastating love. "You're all insane," he whispered. Mira grinned through her exhaustion. Takes one to know one. She grabbed his hand. Ren grabbed his other. Lily pressed against his side, Celia at his back, the others forming a circle around him. "We're your anchor now," Mira said. "All of us together." The rift pulsed. The Demon King's voice echoed through the valley. "Foolish children, you cannot hold what you cannot understand. Watch us," Mira snarled. And together they pushed back. The light that erupted from the academy that day was seen for miles. It wasn't a weapon, wasn't an attack. It was something older, something purer, the combined will of 7 students and one ancient warrior refusing to break. The rift shuddered, contracted, held, and in the darkness beyond, the Demon King screamed with frustration. "This changes nothing," he hissed. "You delay, you do not defeat. I will return, I will always return, and when I do—" "When you do," Mira interrupted, her voice carrying across dimensions, "we'll be waiting, all of us." The rift snapped shut. Silence fell over the valley, and Kaelen, for the first time in 3 centuries, fell to his knees and wept. Days passed before the valley returned to something resembling normal. The noble coalition's army, seeing the rift close and the demon spawn dissolve, had lost their taste for battle. Baron Vex was found trying to flee through the forest and was now in chains, awaiting the council's judgment. The other noble, suddenly realizing they'd been manipulated by forces beyond their understanding, were falling over themselves to pledge loyalty to the academy. Mira didn't care about any of it. She sat in the infirmary watching Kaelen sleep and felt more tired than she'd ever been in her life. The binding, the sharing had worked, but it had cost them. All of them. Kaelen most of all. "He'll wake soon," Lily said softly, appearing at her side. "His body's just adjusting to not carrying everything alone anymore." Mira nodded without looking away from his face. "He looks younger, you notice. The lines are still there, but lighter somehow. 3 centuries of weight shared with others for the first time." Lily smiled gently. "I'd look younger too." They sat in companionable silence, watching over their teacher. When Kaelen's eyes finally opened, they found Mira immediately. "You're still here," he murmured. "Where else would I be?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly, he reached out and took her hand. "Thank you." Mira squeezed back. "You're welcome." Outside the infirmary window, the sun set over a valley that had changed forever. Soldiers trained, students studied, healers tended the wounded, life continued. And in the shadows beyond the valley, a raven with glowing red eyes watched from a tree branch. It watched the academy, watched the students, watched the ancient warrior who should have died 3 centuries ago. Then it took flight toward the capital, toward the Watchers' Council, where someone had been waiting for this moment, waiting to make their move. Chapter 8: The General's Return. 3 days passed before Kaelen was strong enough to leave the infirmary. 3 days of lying in a narrow bed while Lily fussed over him and Mira refused to leave his side, and the entire valley seemed to hold its collective breath. 3 days of feeling the seal inside him, still there, still heavy, but somehow different, lighter, shared. On the morning of the 4th day, he woke to find Darian sitting in the chair beside his bed, an ancient leather journal open in his lap. "You look better," Darian said without looking up. "Less like a corpse wearing skin." Kaelen's lips twitched. "You look the same, which means you haven't slept since the battle. Someone had to keep things running while you napped like a princess in a fairy tale." Darian finally looked at him, and despite the tiredness in his eyes, warmth flickered. "The students are fine. Mira's been drilling them twice as hard since you went down, says she's honoring your legacy or some such nonsense. The veterans are impressed. Terrified, but impressed." Kaelen sat up slowly, his joints protesting the movement. "And the council?" Darian's expression darkened. "Silent. No messages, no summons, no acknowledgement that any of this happened. Seraphine sent a private inquiry through back channels, but the others—" He shook his head. "They're pretending, like they always do." Kaelen wasn't surprised. The council had spent 3 centuries pretending the demon threat was over. Admitting otherwise would mean admitting they'd been negligent, complacent, wrong. "The journal," he said quietly. "You brought it." Darian looked down at the worn leather in his hands. "I've carried it for 300 years. Read it 1,000 times. Every entry, every memory, every moment of the war we fought together." His voice dropped. "And every moment after." He held it out. "I want you to read it, all of it, not just the last entry, everything. I want you to understand what those 3 centuries were like for those of us left behind." Kaelen took the journal, feeling its weight physical and otherwise. Darian, just read it. Darian stood, his ancient face unreadable. I'll be outside when you're done. He left before Kaelen could respond. The first entries were familiar: battle reports, troop movements, the endless logistics of waging war against an enemy that didn't tire or fear. Kaelen had lived those moments. Reading about them felt like visiting old wounds. But as the pages turned, the tone shifted. Kaelen fell today. I watched it happen, watched him pour everything he had into that seal, watched his body crystallize, watched him stop. The medics say he's not dead. Not exactly, but he's not alive either. He's just gone. I don't know what to do. I've never known what to do without him. He's been my anchor since we were children, the one who always knew the right path, the right choice. Now I'm standing in the ashes of a battlefield with an army that looks to me for answers, and I have nothing, nothing but this hole where my friend used to be. Thuron would know what to say, but Thuron's gone too. Everyone's gone except me. Why am I always the one left behind? Kaelen's hand tightened on the page. He remembered that day, remembered the searing pain of the seal taking hold, the terrible emptiness of being pulled away from everything he loved. He'd never considered what it looked like from the outside. The entries continued, year after year. 10 years, the kingdom is rebuilding. People are smiling again. They've already started forgetting. The council sees to that. Every mention of the war is scrubbed from records. Every hero's name buried in archives no one will ever read. They say it's for the best. They say people need peace, not memories of horror. They say a lot of things. I've kept the core together, told them we're mercenaries now, told them we'll fight for coin, told them whatever lies they need to hear. But they know the truth. They're waiting, like me, like all of us, waiting for something that might never come. 50 years, 100, 200. Kaelen read about funerals, dozens of them, then hundreds, as the veterans of the demon war finally succumbed to age. He read about Darian standing alone at grave after grave, the last of his generation, watching everyone he'd ever known fade into memory. He read about the research. I've found something, buried in the council's restricted archives, a text so old it predates the First Kingdom. It describes a ritual, a way to transfer the seal's anchor from one soul to another. It would kill me, I understand that. The transfer requires the new anchor to be fully conscious, fully aware, fully willing to accept the burden, and once accepted, it can't be undone. But Kaelen would be free. 300 years he's been in that void. 300 years of nothing while I walked in the sun, ate warm food, felt the wind on my face. It's not fair. It's never been fair. I'm going to do it. When the seal weakens enough, when he's close enough to reach, I'm going to take his place. He'll never forgive me, but he'll be alive. He'll be free. That's enough. Kaelen's vision blurred. He wiped his eyes angrily and kept reading. The final entry was dated just 3 months ago, right around the time the seal first began to crack. He's waking up. I can feel it. A shift in the seal, a tremor in the fabric of the world. After 3 centuries, Kaelen is finally coming back. I should be happy, I am happy, but I'm also terrified. Because if he's waking, it means the seal is failing. It means the demon king is stirring. It means everything we fought for, everything we sacrificed, is hanging by a thread. And I have to make a choice. The ritual is ready. I've spent centuries preparing, researching, ensuring every detail is perfect. When the moment comes, I can transfer the seal to myself. Kaelen will be free. The demon king will still be contained. Everyone wins. Everyone except me. But that's how it should be. He's carried this burden long enough. It's my turn now. I hope he understands. I hope he doesn't hate me for stealing his sacrifice. I hope he lives, really lives, and finds something worth living for. That's all I've ever wanted for. That's all I've ever wanted. The journal ended there. Kaelen sat in the infirmary bed, the book clutched in his hands, tears streaming down his weathered face. 3 centuries of watching everyone die, of carrying an impossible weight, of waiting for a chance to sacrifice himself for his friend. And Darian had never said a word. Kaelen found Darian at the edge of the training ground, the same spot where he himself had stood so many mornings. His oldest friend sat on the bench, staring at the setting sun, his ancient face carved from grief and resignation. Kaelen sat beside him without speaking. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Darian spoke, his voice rough. "You read it, every word. And now you're going to tell me I'm an idiot, that I should have moved on, that I wasted 3 centuries on a ghost." Kaelen was quiet for a moment. Then, "No." Darian looked at him, surprised. "I'm going to tell you that you're the bravest man I've ever known, that you carried a weight I never should have asked you to carry, that for 300 years while I floated in nothing, you lived with the memory of everyone we lost, and you kept going." He turned to face his friend fully. "I'm going to tell you that I don't deserve you, that I never did, and that if you think for 1 second I'm going to let you take my place in that seal, you're even more insane than Mira." Darian's eyes glistened. "Kaelen." "No." Kaelen's voice was firm. "You listened to me for 3 centuries. Now you're going to listen to me for 5 minutes. We're not doing the ritual, not the way you planned. We're doing it our way together, all of us, sharing the burden so no one has to carry it alone." The students already volunteered. In case you haven't noticed, they're even more stubborn than we were. They're not going to let either of us sacrifice ourselves. They're going to fight alongside us, carry with us, live with us. Kaelen gripped Darian's shoulder, the same grip he'd used 1,000 times before. "You spent 3 centuries waiting for me. Now I'm asking you to spend a little more time living with me. Can you do that?" Darian stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly, impossibly, a smile spread across his ancient face. A real smile, warm and unguarded and young. "You always did have a way of making the impossible sound simple." "It's not simple. It's going to be the hardest thing we've ever done." Kaelen's own lips curved. "But I'd rather do something hard with you than something easy alone." They sat in companionable silence as the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Behind them, the academy hummed with life. Soldiers training, students studying, healers tending the wounded. Life. Real life after so long. Then Mira's voice shattered the peace. "There you are. Do you have any idea how worried we've been? Lily's been checking the infirmary every hour. Ren's been tracking your energy signature like an obsessed stalker. And I..." She stopped short, taking in the scene before her. 2 ancient warriors sitting on a bench, tear tracks still visible on their faces, the journal resting between them. "Oh," she said softly, "is this a moment should I come back?" Kaelen beckoned her forward. "Come here, you ridiculous child." Mira approached warily, her usual bravado tempered by something softer. She sat on the bench beside them, sandwiching herself between 2 men who'd lived longer than her entire civilization. "Is everything okay?" she asked quietly. Kaelen looked at Darian. Darian looked at Kaelen. Together they looked at Mira. "Everything," Kaelen said, "is going to be okay, because we're not alone anymore, any of us." Mira's eyes widened. Then slowly she smiled, that fierce, brilliant smile that had first caught Kaelen's attention all those weeks ago. "Took you long enough to figure that out." Darian laughed, a real laugh, rusty from disuse but genuine. "She's definitely your student." "The worst one," Kaelen agreed. "The absolute worst." Mira beamed. That night, for the first time since the battle, the entire camp gathered for a meal. Not a war council, not a strategy session, just food and firelight and the simple pleasure of being alive. Veterans swapped stories with students, healers danced with soldiers. Even the newest recruits, still shaky from their first real combat, found themselves laughing at jokes they didn't quite understand. Kaelen watched from the edges, a bowl of stew cooling in his hands, and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 centuries. Peace. Not the hollow peace of acceptance, not the grim peace of duty fulfilled. Real peace, warm and full and shared. Mira appeared beside him, a bread roll in each hand. "You're brooding again." "I'm observing there's a difference." "You're brooding." She bit into a roll with satisfaction. "But I'll allow it, since you look less like a tragic hero and more like a grumpy grandfather tonight." Kaelen raised an eyebrow. "Grandfather. Spiritual grandfather, it's a thing." She grinned. Ren explained it, something about mentorship and legacy and emotional investment. "I stopped listening after grandfather." Despite himself, Kaelen felt his lips twitch. "You're impossible. And yet here you are, eating stew, brooding slightly less than usual, making progress." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their strange family celebrate survival. Then Ren appeared, his quiet face troubled. "Kaelen, there's something you should see." The warmth drained from the moment. Kaelen set down his stew. "What is it?" Ren led them to the eastern perimeter, the same spot where the demon spawn had attacked weeks ago. Now, in the moonlight, something new waited. A message, carved into the trunk of an ancient oak, the letters burning with dark energy. The council sees all. The council KNOWS all. The council judges all. Present yourself for judgment, anomaly, or watch your family burn. Beneath the words, a symbol, the crest of the Watcher's Council. But twisted, corrupted, wrong. Kaelen stared at the message, his ancient mind racing through possibility. The council had been silent since the battle, too silent. And now this, a threat, delivered in the council's name but carrying the taint of something darker. This isn't from them, Mira said slowly. Is it? Kaelen shook his head. The council has many flaws, but they don't threaten family. They don't use fear like this. He touched the burning letters, feeling their energy. This is from someone using the council, someone inside, feeding information to the enemy. Darian appeared at his shoulder, having followed silently. A traitor, on the Watcher's Council itself. It's the only explanation. Kaelen's voice was grim. The Demon King knew about the Academy too quickly. The attacks came too precisely. Someone's been guiding him, feeding him intelligence, coordinating his strikes. Ren's quiet voice cut through the tension. If there's a traitor on the council, nowhere is safe. Not the Academy, not the camp, not even. He stopped, but everyone knew what he meant. Not even each other. Mira grabbed Kaelen's arm. What do we do? Kaelen looked at the message, at the threat to his family, to everything he'd built, to everyone he loved. And for the first time since emerging from the seal, he felt something other than weariness. He felt anger. We find them, he said quietly. We root out the traitor no matter how high they sit. And then, he turned to face his students, his soldiers, his family. Then we show them what happens when you threaten the people we love. Mira's eyes blazed with matching fire. How do we start? Kaelen looked at the capital, at the distant towers where the council sat in judgment, unaware that one of their own had turned to darkness. We start by going where we're not welcome. We start by demanding answers. His voice hardened into the tone that had once commanded armies. We start by reminding them that some monsters wear human faces, and those are the ones worth hunting most of all. The message on the tree flickered and died, its dark energy dissipating into the night. But the threat remained, and somewhere in the capital, in a chamber lit by no natural light, a figure in dark robes smiled. Come, old soldier, they murmured. Come see what's waiting for you in the dark. The raven with glowing red eyes cawed once and took flight toward the valley, toward the camp, toward the academy, toward the family Kaelen had sworn to protect. The hunt was about to begin. Chapter 9. The Truth in the Pages. Dawn broke over a valley that no longer felt like home. The message carved into the ancient oak had changed everything. Soldiers moved with new purpose, checking weapons, reinforcing defenses, eyeing the horizon with suspicion that had nothing to do with demons. The enemy wasn't just out there anymore. The enemy was inside, watching, waiting, reporting. Kaelen stood in the command tent, surrounded by maps and reports and the faces of people he'd die to protect. Darian at his right hand, Mira at his left. The 7 original students arranged around them like a living shield. We need to move, Darian said flatly. If there's a traitor on the council, every day we stay here is another day they feed information to the enemy. Another day the Demon King learns our weaknesses. And go where? Mira challenged. The capital. Walk into the lion's den without knowing which lions are actually wolves. She's right. Celia's tactical mind was already working through the possibility. If we march on the council, we play into the traitor's hands. They'll paint us as aggressors, as threats to the established order. The other council members might not believe us, might even turn against us. Kaelen listened to them argue, letting the voices wash over him. He'd learned long ago that the best plans came not from a single mind, but from the collision of many. Then Ren spoke, so quietly that everyone stopped to hear. What if we don't go to them? What if we make them come to us? The tent went silent. Explain, Kaelen said. Ren stepped forward, pointing at the map. The traitor wants us isolated, vulnerable. That's why they've been feeding information to the Demon King, to wear us down, to make us desperate. But if we suddenly become stronger, if we do something that forces the council's hand, they'll have to respond. And when they do, the traitor will reveal themselves. Mira's eyes widened. You mean? I mean we stop hiding, stop training in secret. We announce to the entire kingdom that the Azure Willow Academy is rebuilding, that we're accepting students, training warriors, preparing for a threat the council has been ignoring for 3 centuries. Celia gasped. The nobles will lose their minds. They'll see it as a direct challenge. Exactly. Ren's quiet voice held steel. And some of those nobles are working with the traitor. When they panic, when they demand the council act, the traitor will have to choose. Stay silent and let us grow, or make a move and reveal themselves. Kaelen studied his quiet student with new respect. You've been thinking about this all night. Ren met his gaze without flinching. We can't fight an enemy we can't see, so we force them into the light. Darian let out a low whistle. Kid's got stones, I'll give him that. Mira grabbed Ren's arm, grinning. You beautiful, quiet genius. This might actually work. It might also get us all killed, Lily pointed out gently. If the traitor decides to strike directly, then we'll be ready. Kaelen's voice cut through the chatter. Ren's right, we can't keep reacting. It's time to act. He turned to the map, his ancient eyes blazing with purpose. Darian, send word to every village within a week's march. The Azure Willow Academy is accepting new students. Anyone willing to fight, anyone willing to learn. Promise them food, shelter, and the best training this kingdom has ever seen. Darian grinned, a wolf smile. The nobles are going to hate this. That's the point. The next 3 weeks were chaos incarnate. Word spread faster than anyone anticipated. Within days, the first wave of recruits arrived. Farmers' sons with calloused hands, blacksmiths' daughters who'd swung hammers since childhood, orphans with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Then came the second wave, and the third, until the valley swelled with hundreds of new faces. The Black Banner Corps veterans worked themselves to exhaustion, training raw recruits in the fundamentals of combat. The 7 original students became squad leaders, each commanding a group of 20 newcomers. Mira discovered she had a gift for inspiring terrified teenagers. Ren's quiet intensity made his squad hang on every word. Lily's gentle encouragement turned her group into a family. And at the center of it all, Kaelen watched and guided and believed. You're pushing them too hard, Darian said one evening, watching another squad collapse after a brutal training session. They're going to break. They're going to break anyway when the demons come. Kaelen's voice was quiet but certain. Better they break now, under my eye, where we can put them back together. Better they learn their limits in safety than in battle. Darian studied his old friend. You've changed. Have I? 3 centuries ago, you would have trained them harder, faster. You would have pushed until they either became warriors or died trying. Darian's voice held no judgment, just observation. Now you watch them collapse and you look like it hurts you. Kaelen was quiet for a long moment. Then, 3 centuries ago, I didn't have anything to lose. They were soldiers, replaceable, expendable, necessary. Now, he looked at the training grounds, at the hundreds of young faces, at the 7 who become his family. Now every single one of them feels like losing Thuron all over again. Darian's hand landed on his shoulder. That's not weakness, old friend. That's what makes you worth following. The Noble Coalition's response came faster than expected. Baron Vex, still in chains awaiting trial, had somehow sent messages to his ally, or someone had sent them for him. Within 2 weeks of the Academy's expansion announcement, a new army began gathering at the valley's edge. This one was larger than before, better organized. And this time they weren't alone. Mira spotted them from the watchtower, not just soldiers but mages. Dozens of them, their robes marking them as members of the Council's magical corps. Official sanction, government approval. Kaelen, she called down, you need to see this. He climbed to her position in second, his ancient eyes scanning the horizon. When he saw the mages, his expression didn't change, but Mira felt the temperature drop around him. The council, she whispered. They're actually sending the council. Not the council. Kaelen's voice was ice. The traitor, using the council's authority to crush us before we grow too strong. Below, a herald rode forward, a white flag raised. Traditional parley, traditional trap. Kaelen descended to meet him alone. The herald was a young man, barely older than Mira, with the polished manner of noble breed and the terrified eyes of someone who knew he was delivering a death sentence. By order of the Watchers' Council, he announced, his voice carrying across the valley, the Azure Willow Academy is hereby declared a threat to kingdom stability. All military training must cease immediately. All recruits must be disbanded, and the individual known as Kaelen must present himself to the council for judgment within 3 days, or face Or face what? Kaelen interrupted quietly. The herald swallowed. Immeasurable force. Kaelen looked past him, at the army gathered at the valley's edge, at the mages preparing spells that could level mountains. Then he looked back at the academy, at the hundreds of young faces watching from the walls, at the 7 who'd become his heart. Tell your master, he said slowly, that I've faced immeasurable force before. Tell them I faced it for 3 centuries while they sat in comfort and called themselves rulers. Tell them. He paused, and something shifted in his ancient eyes. Tell them that if they want me, they'll have to go through my students first. And my students don't break. The herald's face went pale. Sir, please, I'm just delivering the message. I don't want. I know, Kaelen's voice softened. Go home, boy, find a different line of work. This one ends badly for everyone involved. The herald fled. Behind him, the army began to march. The next 3 days were a blur of preparation. Kaelen worked alongside his students, reinforcing defenses, positioning troops, planning for every possible scenario. The 7 original students moved through the ranks like living legends. Mira inspiring, Ren guiding, Lily healing, Celia coordinating. The newer recruits, terrified but determined, took strength from their example. On the evening of the 3rd day, Kaelen gathered everyone in the main courtyard. 300 faces looked back at him, 300 hearts beating with fear and hope and desperate courage. In a few hours, he began, his voice carrying without effort, an army will march into this valley. They outnumber us. They out-equip us. They have mages who can level buildings with a thought and soldiers who have trained their entire lives for battles like this. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. But they don't have what we have. They don't have each other. They don't have the bonds forged in fire and blood and shared purpose. They're an army. We're a family. Mira's hand found his. Ren stood at his other side. The 7 formed a circle around him, their presence a living shield. Tomorrow we show them what family means. Tomorrow we show them that the weakest academy in the kingdom has become the strongest. Tomorrow. A horn blast interrupted him, distant but growing closer. The army was marching, in the dark, earlier than expected. Kaelen's eyes blazed. Tonight, he corrected, tonight we show them. The battle began before moonrise. The noble coalition's army surged into the valley, torches blazing, war cries echoing off the mountains. Behind them, the mages began their work, fireballs arcing through the night, lightning dancing between clouds, earth trembling beneath their feet. But the academy was ready. Ren's perception, amplified by Lily's magic, gave them warning of every attack before it landed. Celia's coordination turned chaos into order, directing defenders to each breach, each weakness, each opportunity. Mira led the countercharges, her squad moving like a single organism, striking and retreating before the enemy could react. And Kaelen stood at the center, not fighting, not yet, but holding the line, holding the hope, holding the space for his family to do what they'd trained to do. Darian fought beside him, the 2 ancient warriors moving in perfect synchronization, their bond unbroken by 3 centuries of separation. Veterans of the Black Banner Corps formed an unbreakable core around them, their centuries of waiting finally finding purpose. The first wave broke against the academy's walls and retreated. The second wave followed. The third. By dawn, the valley floor was littered with the wounded and the dead. Not from the academy, Kaelen's forces had held with minimal casualties, but from the coalition army who'd never expected such fierce resistance. The mages, exhausted from a night of spellcasting, had fallen back to regroup. The soldiers, demoralized by their failure, huddled in camp and wondered what came next. Mira found Kaelen on the wall, watching the sunrise paint the blood-soaked valley in shades of gold. We did it, she breathed. We actually held them. For now, Kaelen's voice was quiet. They'll regroup, come again, and next time they'll bring more. Mira's triumph dimmed. How many times can we do this? As many as we have to. He turned to face her, and despite the exhaustion in his eyes, warmth flickered there. You were magnificent tonight, all of you. Mira felt tears prick at her eyes. We learned from the best. Behind them, the academy stirred to life. Healers tending wounds, soldiers checking equipment, students sharing stories of bravery and near misses. Life, continuing despite everything. Then Ren's voice cut through the morning calm. Kaelen, the horizon. They turned and felt their blood freeze. The sky was darkening, not with clouds but with something else. Something wrong, something hungry. Rifts were opening, dozens of them, hundreds, pouring forth not demons but shadows, living darkness that blotted out the sun as it spread across the sky. "The Demon King," Kaelen whispered. "He knows what we did. He knows we're weakened. He's accelerating his escape." Mira gripped his arm. "How long?" Kaelen's ancient eyes tracked the spreading darkness, calculating distances, timing hope. 3 days, maybe less. He turned to face his family, his students, his soldiers, his reason for living. "We have 3 days to prove that a handful of outcasts and old soldiers can do what armies couldn't. 3 days to become legend." Mira's chin lifted, that familiar defiance blazing in her eyes. "Then we'd better get started." Behind them the darkness spread, and somewhere in the capital, in a chamber lit by no natural light, the traitor smiled. 3 days, they murmured. "Perfect." The raven with glowing red eyes took flight toward the valley, carrying a message that would change everything. The final battle was coming, and this time, not everyone would survive. Chapter 10: The Academy's First Stand. The darkness spread across the sky like ink bleeding through fabric, swallowing stars one by one, until only a sick twilight remained. The valley, which had known dawn just hours ago, now lay under a perpetual gloom that seemed to press against the skin and whisper in the shadows. Kaelen stood on the academy wall and watched the end begin. Mira climbed up beside him, her face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. She didn't speak, just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sky die. 3 days, she finally whispered. "It doesn't feel like enough time." "It never does." Kaelen's voice was quiet, steady, the voice of a man who'd faced apocalypse before. "In the demon war, we never knew how much time we had. Could be hours, could be months. We learned to make every moment count." Mira nodded slowly. "What do we do first?" "Same thing we always do. Train, prepare, trust each other." He turned to face her, and despite everything, his eyes held warmth and hope. "That it's enough." Behind them, the camp stirred to life. Soldiers rising, students gathering, the whole valley preparing for what came next. They had 3 days until the Demon King manifested fully. 3 days to become something greater than themselves. 3 days to become legends. Day 1, the nobles' army. They came at dawn, not from the rifts, but from the eastern pass. The noble coalition, reinforced by fresh troops and desperate to prove themselves before the real threat arrived. Mira watched them march and felt something she hadn't expected: pity. "They don't know," she murmured. "They have no idea what's coming." Ren stood beside her, his quiet perception reaching toward the approaching army. "Some of them do. I can feel it: fear, confusion, doubt. They've been told we're the enemy, but their instincts know better." "Doesn't matter what they know," Celia said flatly. "They're still coming, still planning to kill us. We can't afford mercy." Mira thought about that, about the soldiers marching toward death, about the families waiting for them at home, about the lies that had brought them here. Then she thought about her own family, her own home, the people depending on her. "No mercy," she agreed, "but also no cruelty. We do this clean, fast, and then we turn to face the real enemy." Celia nodded, something like respect flickering in her eyes. "That's the right call." The battle was over in hours. The Black Banner Corps met the noble army in the valley's narrow neck and simply dismantled them. 3 centuries of training against 3 months of conscription. Veterans who'd fought demons against farmers who'd never held a real sword. It wasn't a battle, it was a lesson. Kaelen didn't fight. He stood on the hill overlooking the engagement and watched his soldiers work, nodding each victory, each near miss, each moment of brilliance or failure. This was the new generation proving itself, and he needed to see it all. Darian appeared at his side, blood-spattered but smiling. "They're good, really good. The veterans are saying it's like watching us in the early years." "Better," Kaelen's voice held quiet pride. "We were fighting for survival. They're fighting for each other. There's a difference." Below, Mira led a charge that broke the enemy's last formation, her squad moving like a single organism, attacking, retreating, supporting, all without apparent communication. Ren's perception guided them around ambushes. Lily's magic kept them fighting past exhaustion. Celia's coordination turned chaos into symphony. By noon, Baron Vex was in chains again, this time surrounded by his former allies, who were falling over themselves to surrender. Mira climbed the hill to Kaelen, her face flushed with victory. "That's done. What's next?" Kaelen pointed at the sky. The darkness was closer now, lower, and through it shapes moved, things with too many limbs, too many eyes, too much hunger. The real fight, he said quietly. Get everyone back to the academy. Rest while you can. Tomorrow we face the demons. Day 2, the sea. They came at midnight, not in waves but all at once. The rifts split open like wounds in reality, and from them poured horrors that defied description. Demon spawn of every shape and size, their roars shaking the mountain, their claws tearing the earth, their eyes fixed on the tiny academy that dared to resist. The first assault nearly broke them. Mira found herself separated from her squad, surrounded by creatures that moved like nightmares given form. She fought on instinct, her training taking over, but there were too many, always too many. Then Ren was there, then Lily, then Celia, then all of them forming a circle, fighting back to back, becoming the organism they'd trained to be. Left side, Ren called out, and Mira was already moving, her blade finding a demon's throat before she consciously aimed. Behind you, and Lily's magic strengthened her before the blow could land. Break right, and Celia's coordination turned their retreat into a trap, drawing the demons into a kill zone where the veterans waited. They fought through the night and into the dawn, through exhaustion and fear and wounds that would have killed anyone else. They fought because stopping meant dying, and dying meant letting Kaelen face this alone. And through it all, Kaelen fought at the center. The students caught glimpses of him between battle, a blur of motion that left demon spawn in pieces, a calm voice issuing orders that turned the tide, a presence so powerful that even the most ancient demons hesitated to approach. He was everything they'd imagined, everything they'd hoped, everything they'd come to love. But they also saw the cost. With every demon he killed, the seal inside him flickered. With every moment of power, the darkness crept closer. He was winning the battle but losing himself. By nightfall of the second day, the demon spawn had retreated, temporarily, regroupingly, but retreated nonetheless. The valley floor was littered with their bodies. The academy walls, battered and scarred, still stood. And Kaelen stood alone at the center of the carnage, his ancient face turned toward the sky, toward the largest rift, toward the enemy who was almost ready to come through. Mira approached slowly, afraid of what she'd find. Kaelen, he turned, and for a moment, just a moment, his eyes weren't his own. Something else looked out from them, something dark, something hungry. Then it passed, and he was himself again. Tomorrow, he said quietly, he comes tomorrow. Mira nodded, her heart breaking. We'll be ready. Kaelen looked at her, at this fierce, foolish, wonderful girl who'd become his heart, and for the first time since the battle began, he smiled. I know. Day 3, the manifestation. Dawn didn't come on the third day. The darkness was complete now, a blanket of absolute black that swallowed light and hope in equal measure. The only illumination came from the rifts themselves, pulsing with sick energy, growing larger with every passing hour. The academy's defenders gathered in the courtyard, their numbers sadly reduced after 2 days of fighting. The Black Banner Corps had lost a third of its veterans. The students had lost friends, squadmates, family, but those who remained stood tall, their eyes fixed on the sky, their hands gripping weapons that felt too small for what was coming. Kaelen stood before them, Darian at his side, the 7 original students forming a ring around them both. Today, he began, his voice carrying across the silent crowd, we face the enemy I've been fighting for 3 centuries. Today, we prove that the demon war never really ended. It just waited for us to be ready. He looked at each face in turn, veterans who'd followed him for centuries, students who'd found him weeks ago, soldiers who'd come from distant villages to stand against the dark. I won't lie to you. Some of us won't survive this day. Some of us will fall and their names will be forgotten and the world will never know what they sacrificed. His voice hardened. But we'll know. The people standing beside you will know. And when this is over, when the Demon King is sealed again, the memory of what you did here today will live on in every person who survives. Mira felt tears streaming down her face and didn't wipe them away. 3 days ago, I told you we had to become legends, but legends aren't born from victory. They're born from choice. The choice to stand when you could run, to fight when you could hide, to love when you could protect yourself by staying alone. He looked at Mira, at Ren, at Lily, at Celia, at all of them. You made that choice. every single one of you. And because you did, I'm not alone anymore. Because you did, I have something worth fighting for." He raised his sword, the same blade that had ended the demon war 3 centuries ago. "So today we fight. Today we stand. Today we show the darkness what happens when light refuses to die." The crowd roared, a sound of defiance that shook the mountain. And in the sky, the largest rift split open. He came through slowly, deliberately, savoring the moment. The Demon King was immense, towering over the valley, his form shifting between shapes, his eyes burning with hatred 3 centuries old. He wore the shadows like a cloak, and where he stepped, the ground withered and died. "Kaelen," he boomed, and his voice was the sound of worlds ending. 300 years I've waited, 300 years I've dreamed of this moment. And now, he looked at the gathered defenders, at the tiny academy, at the old warrior who dared to face him. "Now you bring children to fight for you. How far the mighty have fallen." Kaelen stepped forward alone to meet him. "I brought family," he corrected quietly. "There's a difference." The Demon King laughed, a terrible sound that made the survivors cover their ears. "Family? These insects. I will crush them and you will watch and then." "No." The voice came from behind Kaelen. Mira stepped forward, then Ren, then Lily, then Celia, then all of them, the 7 original students forming a line beside their teacher. "You don't get to touch him," Mira said. "Not anymore, he's ours." The Demon King's eyes narrowed, little lambs so eager for slaughter. He raised a hand, and darkness gathered, a blast of pure oblivion aimed directly at the line of students. Kaelen moved to intercept, but Mira grabbed his arm. "Trust us," she whispered. And then the ritual began. The 7 students had been practicing for weeks, not just combat but unity, sharing, becoming one in a way that transcended normal understanding. Now, in the moment of greatest need, that practice became reality. Ren's perception expanded to encompass them all, feeding information directly into their shared consciousness. Lily's magic wove through each of them, strengthening, healing, connecting. Celia's tactical mind processed 1,000 variables simultaneously, guiding their movements with impossible precision. And Mira became their heart. She felt them all, their fears, their hopes, their determination, and she channeled that feeling into something greater than any of them could be alone. When the Demon King's blast struck, it didn't hit 7 individuals. It hit one organism with 7 hearts, and that organism refused to fall. Kaelen watched in wonder as his students, his children, his family, stood against the greatest evil the world had ever known and held. The blast dissipated around them, unable to find purchase, unable to break what was already broken and rebuilt into something stronger. The Demon King's eyes widened. What is this?" "This," Kaelen said, stepping forward to stand with them, "is what you never understood. This is what defeated you 3 centuries ago and what will defeat you now. Not power, not strategy, love." He raised his sword, and behind him, every soldier, veteran and student alike, raised theirs. For the academy, the charge began. The battle that followed would be told in whispers for generations. Kaelen faced the Demon King directly, their conflict shaking the foundations of reality. Darian led the veterans against the demon spawn that poured from the rifts. The 7 students moved through the chaos like a single entity, appearing wherever they were needed most, turning the tide again and again. But the Demon King was ancient, powerful, patient, and he'd been planning this moment for 3 centuries. As Kaelen pressed his advantage, as the seal inside him pulsed with shared strength, the Demon King suddenly smiled. "Fools," he boomed, "you think unity is your strength? Look closer at your precious general. Look at what he's been hiding since the moment he returned." Kaelen froze. And then, for the first time, his students saw the truth. His form flickered just for a moment, and in that moment they saw it. The darkness inside him, the shade he'd absorbed festering in his soul. The Demon King's influence, growing stronger with every battle, every use of power, every moment of connection. He was dying, had been dying since the moment he returned, and he'd never told them. Mira's scream tore through the battlefield. "No." The Demon King laughed, pressing his advantage, driving Kaelen to his knees. "He's been mine since the shade touched him. Every day a little more of him fades. Every battle a little more of me takes hold. By the time this is over, there won't be a Kaelen left to save." The students looked at each other, at Ren's pale face, at Lily's tears, at Celia's crumbling composure. They looked at the battle raging around them, at the soldiers fighting and dying, at the academy that had become home. And they made a choice. The ritual, Mira said. Now. Ren's eyes widened. But it's not ready, we're not strong enough. Doesn't matter. Mira's voice was steel. We do it anyway. We share his burden, all of us, right now, or we lose him forever. She looked at her family, her real family, the one she'd found in this crumbling academy with a broken old man who taught them to believe. I'd rather die trying than live knowing I didn't. One by one they nodded. The chant began softly, almost too quiet to hear over the battle's chaos. But as the 7 students joined hands and focused their will, it grew. Ancient words, older than the kingdom, older than the war, older than anything but the darkness itself. Words of binding and sharing and love. Kaelen felt it before he understood it. A tug at the seal inside him, a lightening of the weight he'd carried for 3 centuries. He turned, horrified, to find his students glowing with borrowed power, their faces contorted with pain. No, he tried to break free to stop them, but the Demon King held him fast. You can't, you're not ready, you'll die. Then we die, Mira gasped, her voice somehow carrying through the chaos. Better than watching you die alone. The light grew brighter. The seal inside Kaelen shifted, cracked, opened, and suddenly he wasn't carrying it alone anymore. 7 new souls linked to his, 7 hearts beating in rhythm with his own, 7 burdens shared, distributed, made bearable. The pain was immense for all of them. Mira screamed. Ren collapsed. Lily's healing magic flared and flickered, but they held. And the Demon King screamed, because the seal that had held him for 3 centuries was no longer a single chain. It was a net, woven from 7 souls and 1 ancient warrior, and that net was pulling. No, this isn't, you can't. I will not be denied. But he was. The net tightened, dragging him back toward the rift, back toward the prison he'd spent 3 centuries trying to escape. He fought, he raged. He poured every ounce of his ancient power into breaking free. And 7 students, and 1 old general held firm. The rift snapped shut, with a sound like reality itself screaming. Silence. Kaelen caught Mira as she fell. She was light, too light, her body ravaged by the power she'd channeled. Around them, the other 6 students lay scattered, unconscious but alive. The veterans were already moving, gathering, carrying them to Lily's waiting arms. But Mira was still in Kaelen's arms, her eyes fluttering open, a faint smile on her lips. We did it, she whispered. Kaelen couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything except hold her and weep. You idiot, he finally managed. You absolute, complete, wonderful idiot. Mira's smile widened. Takes one to know one. Her eyes closed, her breathing steadied into sleep. And Kaelen, for the first time in 3 centuries, let himself hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd all survive this after all. The sun rose the next morning. Real sun, golden and warm, burning away the last traces of darkness. The valley, scarred and bloody, slowly came back to life. Healers working, soldiers rebuilding, students gathering to share stories of the battle. In the infirmary, 7 beds held 7 sleeping students. Lily moved among them, her healing magic gentle, her face exhausted but peaceful. They would recover. They would all recover. And Kaelen sat at Mira's bedside, holding her hand, watching her breathe. Darian found him there hours later. The council is sending representatives. Official this time. No tricks, no traitors. Seraphine made sure of it. Kaelen nodded, without looking away from Mira. She also sent this. Darian held out a scroll, its seal unbroken. Personal message, for your eyes only. Kaelen took it, broke the seal, read. Then slowly he smiled. What is it? Darian asked. Kaelen looked up, and in his ancient eyes something new flickered, something that looked almost like peace. She says the traitor has been identified, removed, and the council has officially recognized the Azure Willow Academy as a sanctioned military institution. He paused. They're sending resources, teachers, support. Darian's eyebrows rose. Seriously, after everything. Kaelen looked at Mira, at her sleeping face, at the hand he held. Seems we finally got their attention. Outside the infirmary window, a raven with glowing red eyes watched from a tree branch. It watched the academy, watched the student, watched the ancient warrior who should have died but somehow hadn't. Then it took flight toward the capital, toward shadows that still moved in darkness, toward plans that were only beginning. The Demon King was sealed. But the war was far from over. Chapter 11. The Battle of 3 Days. 3 days passed before Mira opened her eyes. 3 days of Kaelen sitting by her bedside, holding her hand, refusing to move even when Darian brought food or Lily insisted he rest. 3 days of watching her chest rise and fall, of counting each breath like a gift, of remembering what it felt like to be truly terrified of losing someone. When her eyelids finally fluttered, he was there. "Hey," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "You look terrible." Kaelen laughed, a broken, relieved sound that he couldn't have stopped if he tried. "You're one to talk. You've been unconscious for 3 days. Mira's eyes widened slightly. 3 days, the others. Alive, recovering. Lily says you'll all be fine, though she also called you 7 kinds of idiot for attempting the ritual without proper preparation. He squeezed her hand gently. She used stronger language, but I'm paraphrasing. Mira tried to smile, but it turned into a wince. Everything hurts. That's the seal, or rather the sharing. You're carrying part of it now, all of you are. The burden is distributed across 8 souls instead of 1. His voice softened. You saved me, Mira, all of you. I don't know how to thank you. Mira's eyes, still heavy with exhaustion, somehow managed to blaze with their familiar defiance. You don't thank us. You stay. You live. You let us be your family. She gripped his hand with what little strength she had. That's all we've ever wanted. Kaelen bowed his head, and for the first time in 3 centuries, he let the tears fall. The next week was a blur of recovery and rebuilding. Lily worked herself to exhaustion healing the wounded, her magic flowing in constant wave. Ren, recovered faster than the others thanks to his natural resilience, helped coordinate the reconstruction efforts. Celia threw herself into organizing the flood of supplies and support that poured in once the council's recognition became public. And Mira healed slowly, frustrating, her body adjusting to the new weight it carried. Kaelen visited every day, bringing stories from the outside world, sitting with her when the pain was bad, reminding her that she wasn't alone. You're hovering, she told him on the 5th day, but there was no heat. I'm supervising, he corrected. There's a difference. Darian appeared in the doorway, a scroll in his hand. Sorry to interrupt, but you need to see. Kaelen took the scroll, read it, and went very still. What? Mira demanded, struggling to sit up. What is it? Kaelen's voice was carefully controlled. An invitation from the Watchers' Council, formal this time, recognition of the Academy's status, an offer of alliance, and a request for, he paused, a request for representatives to join the Council's Military Advisory Board. Mira's jaw dropped. They want us on the Council. They want you. Kaelen looked up, and something like wonder flickered in his ancient eyes. Specifically you, Mira, and Ren and Celia and Lily, the 7 original students. They're offering you positions as junior advisors, a voice in how the kingdom prepares for future threats. Mira stared at him, her mind struggling to process. A week ago, she'd been a farm girl at a failing academy. Now the most powerful body in the kingdom wanted her advice. What do I tell them? She whispered. Kaelen sat on the edge of her bed, his presence as steady as always. You tell them the truth, that the old ways fail, that hiding from threats doesn't make them disappear, that the only way to face darkness is together, not as individuals but as a family. He smiled, that rare warm smile that transformed his weathered face. And then you make them listen, because if anyone can make a bunch of immortals pay attention, it's you. Mira felt tears prick her eyes. You really believe that? I really do. The ceremony took place a month later, in the grand hall of the Watcher's Tower. Mira stood at the front of her 6 companions, trying not to let her nerves show. Before them, the 7 council members sat in judgment, Seraphine at the center, her ancient face warm with approval. The other members, including several new faces replacing those who'd been exposed as traitors, watched with varying degrees of curiosity and respect. We have reviewed your actions during the recent conflict, Seraphine announced, her voice carrying through the hall. The defense of your academy, the binding ritual that saved General Kaelen, the defeat of the Demon King's manifestation. She paused, her eyes gleaming. These are not the actions of students. These are the actions of heroes. Mira felt Ren's hand squeeze hers, Lily's quiet presence at her back, Celia's steadying influence. They were together. They were always together now. Therefore, by the authority vested in this council, we hereby recognize the Azure Willow Academy as a sanctioned military institution of the highest rank. Its students shall receive full scholarship. Its graduates shall be guaranteed positions in the kingdom's defense forces, and its founder, Seraphine's gaze swept over the 7 young faces, shall be granted titles of nobility, with all rights and responsibilities that entail. The hall erupted in applause. Mira stood frozen, unable to process what she just heard. Nobility, her, a farm girl from nowhere. Kaelen stepped forward from the shadows, his presence immediately quieting the room. "There's one more thing," he said quietly, "if the council permits." Seraphine nodded. "Speak, General." Kaelen turned to face the 7 students, his family, his heart. "I've spent 3 centuries alone, 3 centuries carrying a burden that should have been shared, 3 centuries watching everyone I loved grow old and die while I remain." His voice cracked slightly. "I never thought I'd find another family, never thought I'd have another chance to belong." He knelt, not as a general, not as a legend, just as a man. "So I'm asking formally, humbly, with everything I am, if you'll have me, not as a teacher, not as a commander, as family, as someone who gets to stay." Mira's tears spilled over. She stepped forward and pulled him to his feet, wrapping her arms around him with all her strength. "You idiot," she sobbed. "You've been family since the day you walked through our gates." The others joined them, Ren, Lily, Celia, and the rest, forming a circle around the ancient warrior who'd become their anchor. And in that moment, surrounded by the people who loved him, Kaelen finally understood what Thuron had meant all those centuries ago. Protecting the next generation wasn't about keeping them safe. It was about giving them something worth fighting for. It was about belonging. That night, the Academy celebrated. The valley that had known so much darkness blazed with light, torches and lanterns and magical illuminations arranged by students who'd learned that joy was as important as combat. Music filled the air, played by veterans who remembered songs from before the war. Food flowed freely, prepared by villagers who'd come to thank their protector. Mira found Kaelen at the edge of the celebration, watching the firelight play across his students' faces. "You're brooding again," she said, dropping onto the bench beside him. "I'm observing there's a difference." She grinned. "Sure there is." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their family dance and laugh and live. "Thank you," Kaelen said quietly, "for everything, for refusing to give up on a broken old man, for charging a shade with a stick, for sharing a burden that should never have been yours." Mira leaned her head against his shoulder. "You're welcome for everything, for showing up at our crumbling academy, for teaching us to believe in ourselves, for becoming our family." Kaelen's arm wrapped around her shoulders, holding her close. "I think Thuron would have liked you," he murmured. "You remind me of him, actually. The same stubborn refusal to accept defeat, the same ability to make people believe in impossible things." Mira smiled. "Then I'll take that as the highest compliment." Behind them, the celebration continued, students dancing, veterans laughing, a future being built on the ashes of the past. The Demon King was sealed, the traitors exposed, the Academy recognized. But more than that, a family had been forged. 7 students and 1 ancient warrior, bound by something stronger than blood, bound by choice, bound by love. Chapter 12, The Burden Shared. In the days that followed, life at the Academy settled into a new rhythm. Classes resumed, but different now. Not just combat, but strategy, history, philosophy. The veterans taught what they'd learned in 3 centuries of waiting. The students taught what they'd learned in weeks of fighting. Everyone taught everyone because that was how family worked. Mira threw herself into her new role with characteristic intensity, leading training sessions, advising the council, dragging Kaelen out of his brooding to actually participate in life. Ren became the Academy's unofficial seer, his perception expanding to include not just threats, but opportunities, students who needed help, friendships that could be forged, moments of connection that might otherwise be missed. Lily established a healing program that drew students from across the kingdom, her gentle magic now augmented by knowledge passed down from the Black Banner Corps best medics. Celia's tactical mind found new challenges in organizing the Academy's expansion, her noble background finally useful for something she believed in. And Kaelen taught, mentored, lived. For the first time in 3 centuries, he woke each morning with purpose, Not the grim purpose of duty, but the warm purpose of belonging. Students sought his advice. Veterans shared his memory. Mira dragged him into adventures he'd never have chosen for himself. It was, he realized one evening as he watched the sunset paint the valley in gold, exactly what Thuron had wanted for peace, family, a reason to keep going. 1 month after the ceremony, Mira found him at their usual spot, the bench overlooking the training ground. "We need to talk," she said, her voice unusually serious. Kaelen's heart clenched. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, it's just." She sat beside him, her expression complicated. "The council wants to send me on a diplomatic mission to the neighboring kingdom, to share what we learned here, to build alliances before the next threat appears." Kaelen was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant honor. It's a pain in the ass is what it is." Mira's voice cracked slightly. "I don't want to leave, not now, not when everything's finally good." Kaelen took her hand. "Then don't go." "I have to. They're right, we need allies. We can't face the next war alone." She looked at him, and in her eyes he saw the same fierce determination that had first caught his attention. "But I'll come back, I promise. This is my home now. You're my home now." Kaelen squeezed her hand. "Then go, build your alliances, save the world again." He smiled, that rare, warm smile that was becoming less rare every day. "I'll be here when you return, brooding, observing, driving everyone crazy with my ancient wisdom." Mira laughed, though tears sparkled in her eyes. "You better be." They sat together as the sun set, watching the academy they'd built, the family they'd found, the future they'd fight for. And in the shadows beyond the valley, a single raven with glowing red eyes watched from a tree branch. It watched the old general and the young warrior. It watched the academy blazing with light and life. It watched the hope that had been born from darkness. Then it took flight, not toward the capital this time, but toward something else. Something deeper, something older. Beneath the mountains where the Demon King had been sealed, in chambers that predated human civilization, something stirred. Not the Demon King, something else. Something that had been sleeping since before the First War, waiting for the moment when the world's defenders were tired and happy and unprepared. The raven landed on a stone altar and cawed 3 times, and in the darkness eyes opened, eyes that had not opened in 10,000 years, eyes that saw the academy, saw the light, saw the hope, and smiled. The next morning, Kaelen woke with a chill he couldn't explain. He stood at his window, watching the sun rise over the valley, and felt a wrongness in the air that he couldn't quite name. The seal was stable. The Demon King was contained. Everything was as it should be. And yet, Mira found him there, already packed for her journey. "You're brooding again." "I'm sensing," he corrected. "There's a difference." She raised an eyebrow but didn't push. "I'm leaving in an hour. Walk me to the gate." He nodded, pushing the unease aside. Whatever it was, it could wait. Today, his family. They walked through the Waking Academy, past students training, veterans mentoring, life continuing. At the gate, Mira's escort waited, a company of the Black Banner Corps finest, hand-picked by Darian himself. "I'll be back before you know it," Mira said, her voice bright with forced cheerfulness. "Try not to miss me too much." "Impossible," Kaelen said quietly, "but I'll try." She hugged him fiercely, then pulled back, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Take care of them, all of them." "I will. And take care of yourself. No heroic sacrifices while I'm gone. No promises." She laughed, that familiar, wonderful sound, and mounted her horse. "See you soon, old man. See you soon, ridiculous child." He watched until the company disappeared over the eastern ridge, until the dust settled, until the morning grew quiet. Then he turned back to the academy, to his family, his purpose, his home. Behind him, in the shadows of the gate, a single black feather lay on the ground. Kaelen paused, bent, picked it up. It was warm, wrongly warm, and in its depths he could have sworn he saw eyes looking back at him. He crushed it without thinking, and when he opened his hand, nothing remained but ash. The wind carried it away, and somewhere beneath the mountain, in darkness older than time, something ancient and terrible opened its eyes fully for the first time in 10,000 years. The Demon King had been a servant, a general, a distraction. The real enemy was waking, and the academy, brave, hopeful, beautiful academy, had no idea what was coming. Kaelen stood at the gate, the unease in his chest solidifying into something colder. He'd spent 3 centuries fighting one war. He had a terrible feeling He was about to start another. Chapter 13. Whispers in the Dark. 3 weeks passed since Mira's departure. 3 weeks of relative peace, of rebuilding, of watching the academy transform from a desperate last stand into something resembling a real institution. New students arrived daily, drawn by stories of the battle that had saved the kingdom. Veterans found new purpose in training the next generation. The valley, once a site of death and darkness, bloomed with life. Kaelen should have been happy. He wasn't. The unease that had settled in his chest the morning Mira left had only grown stronger with each passing day. It wasn't the seal, that remained stable, shared now with 7 souls who'd proven their worth. It wasn't the demon king, the prison held, the darkness contained. It was something else, something older, and it was getting closer. Ren found him at dawn, as he always did, standing at the eastern wall, staring at the mountain. "You're not sleeping," the quiet boy observed. "Neither are you." Ren shrugged. "Someone has to watch, since you're too busy brooding to do it properly." Kaelen's lips twitched. Mira's influence had spread to all of them, it seemed. Even gentle Ren had developed an edge. "What do you sense?" Kaelen asked, cutting to the heart of it. Ren's perception had only grown since the binding ritual. He could feel things now that even Kaelen couldn't. Ren was quiet for a long moment, his eyes unfocused, reaching. Then, "There's something under the mountains, deep, older than the Demon King. It's been sleeping for a very long time." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice trembled slightly. "It's waking up." Kaelen's blood ran cold. "How long?" "I don't know, weeks, months. It's not like the Demon King's awakening that was violent, aggressive, intentional. This is natural, like something reaching the end of a very long sleep." Ren turned to face him, and in his young eyes Kaelen saw fear, real fear, the kind that came from understanding exactly what they faced. When it wakes fully, everything changes. Kaelen looked at the mountain, at the ancient peaks that had stood since before the first kingdom, before the first language, before anything but the oldest darkness. "What do we do?" Ren asked quietly. Kaelen thought of Mira, traveling through distant kingdoms, building alliances, thought of his students, sleeping peacefully in the academy, thought of Darian, finally finding purpose after 3 centuries of waiting. "We prepare," he said. "We train, we build, and we pray that whatever's waking gives us enough time." Ren nodded slowly. "And Mira, should we call her back?" Kaelen shook his head. "She's doing exactly what we need, building bridges, making friends, creating alliances. If this new threat is as old as you sense, we'll need every ally we can get." He paused. "But send her a message. Not the details, not yet. Just tell her we miss her. Tell her the academy thrives. Tell her." He stopped, something catching in his throat. "Tell her I'm proud of her." Ren smiled, a rare warm expression. "She knows we all know." The dream started that night. Kaelen hadn't dreamed in 3 centuries. The seal had seen to that, keeping his consciousness suspended in a void where nothing existed but endless awareness. Now, with the burden shared, his mind was free to wander in sleep for the first time since the war. He wished it wasn't. The dream was darkness, not the peaceful dark of night, but something older, something hungry. In it he stood before a vast underground chamber, larger than any city, larger than any cavern should be. And in that chamber something moved. He couldn't see it clearly, his mind refused to show him, but he felt it. Immense, ancient, patient. It had been waiting longer than his species had existed, watching the rise and fall of civilizations with the casual disinterest of something that would outlast them all. And now, for reasons he couldn't understand, it was waking. "Kaelen." The voice wasn't spoken, it was thought, directly into his mind, bypassing his ears and his defenses and everything that made him who he was. "We have watched you, we have waited. The Demon King was a child playing at darkness. We are what he feared." Kaelen tried to move, to speak, to fight, but his dream self was frozen, helpless. "Do not fear. We do not wake to destroy. We wake because we are called. Something in this world has changed, something that makes the old songs worth singing again." A pause, then, terrible in its intimacy. "Something in you." Kaelen woke screaming. Darian burst into his quarters moments later, sword drawn, ready for battle. He found Kaelen sitting on the edge of his bed, drenched in sweat, his ancient eyes wide with something Darian had never seen there before. "Terror." "What happened?" Darian demanded, dropping his sword and gripping his friend's shoulder. "Kaelen, talk to me." Kaelen's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. There's something under the mountains, something older than the Demon King, older than the Council, older than anything we know. He looked up at Darian, and in his eyes Darian saw the weight of 3 centuries and something new, something heavier. It knows my name. Darian went still. The Demon King was a servant, a general, a child playing at darkness. Kaelen's voice cracked. This is what the Demon King feared. This is what everyone feared back before the First War, back when the world was young and the old gods still walked. Darian's face paled. The old gods are myths, stories, things we tell children to frighten them. The stories came from somewhere. Kaelen stood, his legs unsteady. We need to contact the council, now, and Mira, we need to warn Mira. A knock at the door interrupted. Ren's voice urgent. Kaelen, Darian, you need to see this. They followed him to the eastern wall where a crowd had already gathered. Students pointed, veterans whispered. Even Lily, usually so calm, looked pale. The mountains were glowing, faintly like embers beneath ash, but unmistakably glowing. Deep within the ancient peaks, light pulsed and shifted, rhythmic as breathing. As waking, Kaelen stared at the light and felt the dream voice echo in his mind. Something in you has changed. Something in you has called us forth. He didn't understand, couldn't understand. What could he possibly have done to wake an ancient god? Then Ren gasped. Kaelen, your hand. He looked down. His palm, the one that had crushed the raven's feather, was glowing with the same light as the mountain. The next hours were chaos. Darian organized a defensive perimeter, though what weapons could do against something that predated weapons, no one knew. Lily examined Kaelen's hand, her healing magic sliding off the light like water off stone. Ren extended his perception toward the mountains and came back pale and shaken. It's not hostile, he reported, his voice unsteady. Not yet. It's curious, watching, waiting. Waiting for what? Celia demanded. Ren shook his head. I don't know, but I think it's waiting for him. He looked at Kaelen. Whatever that thing is, it knows you, it recognizes you, and it's not going to hurt you, not unless you give it reason to. Kaelen stared at his glowing hand, at the light that pulsed in rhythm with the mountains, and felt the weight of 10,000 years pressing down on him. I don't understand, he whispered. I've never been near those mountains, never fought anything from them. Why would an ancient god know my name? No one had an answer. No one except the raven that landed on the wall beside them, its glowing red eyes fixed on Kaelen. This time it didn't flee, it spoke. You carry his blood, little warrior. His line, thinned by centuries but never broken. He has waited 10,000 years for one of you to return to these lands. And now, the raven tilted its head almost curiously. Now you have. Kaelen stared at the creature, his mind racing. His blood, his line. He was an orphan found on a battlefield, raised by soldiers who'd had no interest in his origins. He'd never known his parents, never known his heritage, never known. He is your ancestor, the raven said, answering the question he hadn't voiced. The first Kaelen, the one who sealed him away 10,000 years ago, trading his freedom for the world's safety. The seal you carry, the one you've shared with your students, is a copy of his original work, a pale imitation but recognizably his. The world tilted around Kaelen, an ancestor, an ancient hero who'd fought this thing, this god, 10,000 years ago, who'd sealed it away at the cost of his own freedom, just as Kaelen had done with the Demon King. History repeating, blood calling to blood. He does not wake to destroy, the raven continued. He wakes because you have proven that his sacrifice was not in vain. You have done what he could not, found others to share your burden, built a family from strangers, created hope where there was only duty. He wants to meet you, to thank you, too. The raven's eyes flared bright, and its voice shifted, became deeper, more resonant, more present. To give you a choice. The mountains blazed with light, and from their depths, something ancient and terrible and wonderful began to emerge. Kaelen stood at the academy wall, his glowing hand raised. His family gathered behind him and faced the awakening of a god. Behind him, Mira's voice, distant, frantic, speaking through a communication crystal Darian had activated, screamed his name. Kaelen, Kaelen, can you hear me? What's happening? The whole kingdom can see the light. He couldn't answer, couldn't speak, could only watch as the mountains opened and something stepped through. It wasn't a monster, wasn't a demon, wasn't anything he'd expected. It was a man. Tall, ancient, weary, and wearing a face that Kaelen saw every morning in his mirror. The first Kaelen walked toward his descendant across 10,000 years of separation, and when he smiled, it was like looking into a future that could have been. "Hello, grandson," he said quietly. "I've waited a very long time to meet you." Kaelen's hand stopped glowing, and somewhere behind him, Mira's voice continued to scream, because on the other side of the kingdom, in the capital she'd been visiting, the same light was emerging from every mountain, every hill, every place where the old gods had been sealed. They weren't waking one, they were waking all of them, and they were all walking toward the academy. Chapter 14, The Gathering Storm. The first Kaelen stood before them like a mirror, reflecting across 10 millennia. He was taller than his descendant, his frame carrying the lean hardness of someone who had never known peace, only survival. His eyes held the same ancient quality as Kaelen's, but deeper, much deeper, with layers of memory that stretched back to before human civilization existed. And his face was Kaelen's face, if Kaelen had never known a moment's rest. "You're wondering why I'm here," the first Kaelen said. His voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried weight, the weight of 10,000 years of solitude. "You're wondering why now, after all this time, I choose to walk among the living." Kaelen, the younger, the one who'd thought himself ancient, struggled to find words. Behind him, his students pressed close, their fear palpable but their loyalty stronger. "I don't understand," he finally managed. "The legends say you sealed the old gods away, sacrificed yourself to save the world. They say you died." The first Kaelen smiled, a sad, knowing expression. "I did die, in a manner of speaking, but death is different for those of us who carry the blood. We don't simply cease. We wait, we watch, we endure." He looked past his descendant, at the academy, at the students, at the light still pulsing from 100 mountains. "Just as you learned to endure." Darian stepped forward, his ancient warrior's face carved from suspicion. "Forgive me, but we've had enough of ancient beings waking up and threatening everything we've built. If you're here to fight, I'm here to warn." The first Kaelen's eyes hardened, "and to offer a choice I was never given." The warning came quickly, and it was worse than anyone imagined. The first Kaelen gathered them in the academy's main hall, the 7 original students, Darian, the senior veteran, and Kaelen himself. Through the communication crystal, Mira's voice crackled with static and fear, patched in from wherever she'd taken shelter in the capital. "There are dozens of them," she reported, her voice tight, "emerging from every mountain range, every ancient ruin, every place the history books said the old gods were sealed. They're not attacking, not yet, but they're walking, all of them, in the same direction." "Toward us," Ren said quietly, "toward the academy." The first Kaelen nodded. "They feel him, the one you carry in your blood, the call of your lineage. To them it's like a beacon, a summons they cannot ignore." Kaelen's jaw tightened. "I didn't summon anyone. You didn't have to." The first Kaelen's voice was gentle but firm. "The blood calls to blood. When you shared your burden with these 7, when you bound them to your soul, you amplified that call. You made yourself visible to those who have been sleeping, waiting, hopping for a sign." Lily's face had gone pale. "Hopping? You make it sound like they want something from us." "They do." The first Kaelen looked at each of them in turn, his ancient eyes carrying the weight of 10,000 years. "They want what I took from them, what I sealed away with my own life." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "They want their hearts back." The story that followed would haunt their dreams for years. 10,000 years ago, the world was different. The old gods walked freely, not as tyrants, not as monsters, but as guardians. They were the original protectors, the first line of defense against the void, the reason life had been able to emerge and flourish in a universe that wanted nothing but darkness. But guardianship required sacrifice. The old gods gave something of themselves to create the barriers that held the void at bay, pieces of their essence, their power, their very hearts. They became less than they had been, diminished but content, because the world they protected thrived. Then the first Kaelen came. He was a warrior like his descendant, a man who'd lost everything to the void's servants and dedicated his life to fighting back. When he learned the truth, that the old gods held the key to permanent victory, that their hearts could be used as weapons, he made a choice. He didn't ask permission, didn't seek counsel, he simply took. One by one he hunted the old gods. One by one he stole their hearts, their essence, their power, their very selves. He didn't destroy them, couldn't destroy them, but he sealed them away, buried them beneath mountains, locked them in prisons of stone and time where they could sleep forever. And with their hearts, he forged a weapon that pushed back the void and saved the world. But the cost, the first Kaelen said quietly, was everything they were, everything they could have been. I didn't just imprison them, I hollowed them, left them as shells, aware but powerless, dreaming of the day their hearts would be returned. He looked at his descendant with eyes full of grief. I thought I was saving the world. I thought the ends justified the means. But I was young and arrogant, and I didn't understand that some debts can never be repaid. Kaelen stared at his ancestor, at the man who'd done the same thing he'd done, made the same choices, carried the same weight. The seal I used on the Demon King came from my research, my techniques, my sins passed down through generations. The first Kaelen nodded slowly. You didn't know, how could you? But the old gods felt it when you bound those children to your soul. They felt the echo of what I'd done. The same pattern, the same method, the same blood. And they knew. Knew what? That one of my line had finally proven worthy of carrying more than just my sin. The first Kaelen smiled, that sad, knowing expression. They knew you might be the one to give them back what I stole. The hall went silent. Outside, the light from the mountains pulsed and shifted, drawing closer with every passing moment. Through the crystal, Mira's voice continued to report. The old gods were converging. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all walking the same path toward the valley. They're not armed, she said, her voice awed despite her fear. They're not carrying weapons or wearing armor, they just walk, and where they pass, people stop fighting, stop arguing, stop everything. It's like they radiate peace. Not peace, the first Kaelen murmured. Memory, they're reminding the world of what was lost, of what could be again. Celia stepped forward, her tactical mind struggling to process a situation that defied all strategy. What do they want? Specifically, if we had their hearts, could we give them back? The first Kaelen looked at her with something like approval. A practical question. Good. He turned to his descendant. The hearts were forged into weapons that still exist, still function, still hold the old god's essence. If those weapons could be brought here, could be offered. Where are they? Kaelen demanded. Tell me where and I'll. You can't. The first Kaelen's voice was gentle but firm. They're scattered across the continent, hidden in vaults and temples and the lairs of creatures who have guarded them for millennia. It would take years to gather them all, years we don't have. Ren spoke up, his quiet voice cutting through the despair. What if we don't need all of them? What if we just need enough to show good faith, to prove that we're different from the one who stole them? The first Kaelen stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly he smiled, a real smile, warm and surprised. You're right, he said. You're absolutely right. They don't need all their hearts back at once. They need to know that the stealing is over, that the next generation of my line is willing to give rather than take. He looked at Kaelen, at his descendant, his legacy, his hope. There's one heart close, very close, hidden in the capital beneath the Watcher's Tower, in a vault that hasn't been opened since the council was founded. His eyes gleamed. If you could retrieve it, if you could bring it here and offer it freely, then we might have a chance. Kaelen turned to the communication crystal. Mira, you're in the capital, you have friends on the council now. Can you get into that vault? Silence, then Mira's voice fierce and determined. Give me 3 days, I'll find a way. The crystal went dark. 3 days. 3 days, until the old gods reached the valley. 3 days to retrieve a heart that had been hidden for 10,000 years. 3 days to prove that the line of Kaelen could be more than takers, could be givers. The academy exploded into activity. Darian organized defensive positions, just in case. Celia coordinated supply lines and communication networks. Ren extended his perception toward the approaching gods, tracking their progress, counting their number. Lily prepared healing stations for casualties that might never come. And Kaelen stood at the wall, watching the mountains glow, and felt the weight of his ancestors' gaze. You're afraid, the first Kaelen observed, appearing beside him. Good, fear means you understand the stakes. I'm afraid of failing them. Kaelen gestured at the academy, at his students, at everything he'd built. They trusted me, believed in me, and now I've led them to the brink of something I don't understand. The first Kaelen was quiet for a moment. Then, I felt the same way 10,000 years ago. When I made my choice, I told myself it was for them, for the people I loved, the world I protected. But really, I was afraid afraid of being weak, afraid of losing, afraid of trusting anyone but myself. He turned to face his descendant fully. You've already done what I couldn't. You've shared your burden, trusted others with your life, built something that doesn't depend on you alone. He smiled, that sad, knowing expression. That's why they're waking now, not to punish you, to thank you, to show you that the old way, the way of taking, of sacrificing alone, of carrying everything yourself, is finally over. Kaelen stared at his ancestor, tears prickling at his ancient eyes. I don't know how to be anything else, he whispered. I've been alone for so long. You're not alone anymore. The first Kaelen gripped his shoulder, the same grip Kaelen had used on Darian, on Mira, on all of them. Look around. Look at what you've built. Look at who stands with you. Kaelen looked at the academy, bustling with life, at his students, training and preparing and believing, at Darian, organizing defenses with the quiet competence of 3 centuries, at Ren and Lily and Celia and all the others, working together, being together. They weren't just his students anymore. They were his family, his real family. And for the first time since the war began, 3 centuries ago, Kaelen understood that he didn't have to fight alone. He never had. On the second day, a messenger arrived from the capital. Not Mira, she was still working, still searching, still fighting her own battle. But the message she'd sent was clear. Found the vault, council's being. Difficult, but I have a plan, trust me. Kaelen read the words 3 times, then folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his shirt, close to his heart. She'll do it, Ren said quietly, appearing at his side. She always does. I know. Kaelen looked toward the mountains, where the light pulsed ever closer. I just hope always holds one more time. On the 3rd day, the old gods arrived. They came at dawn, not as an army. There was nothing military about their approach. They walked in loose groups, their forms shifting between human and something other, their eyes fixed on the valley with expressions that held no malice, only hope. Kaelen stood at the academy gate, his ancestor beside him, his students arrayed behind him. The veterans had formed defensive positions, but no one believed they'd be needed. These beings radiated something that made violence impossible, a deep, ancient peace that settled over the valley like a blessing. The first to reach them was a woman, or what looked like a woman, tall, silver-haired, with eyes that held the depth of ocean. She stopped before Kaelen and studied him for a long moment. You have his face, she said softly, his bearing, his weight. She glanced at the first Kaelen and something flickered in those ancient eyes, not anger, not hatred, but a deep, profound sadness. And you have brought him back to us. The first Kaelen bowed his head. I have no right to ask forgiveness. I took everything from you. I made you less than you were. You did what you thought was necessary. The woman's voice was gentle, cutting through his words. You were wrong, but you were also young and afraid and carrying more than anyone should carry alone. She looked at the younger Kaelen, at his students at the academy. Your descendant has done better. He has learned what you could not. The first Kaelen said nothing. His eyes glistened. The woman turned to Kaelen, the younger, the one who'd somehow become the center of this impossible moment. We have felt your heart, your willingness to share, to trust, to love. It calls to us across the ages. It gives us hope that the old wounds might finally heal. She extended a hand. Your student, the fierce one, she fights for us even now. She battles your counsel, your rules, your fear. She does it because you taught her that some things are worth fighting for. The woman smiled, a warm, radiant expression that lit the valley. When she returns with what we have lost, we will be ready, ready to forgive, ready to heal, ready to become what we once were. Kaelen's voice cracked. And if she doesn't return? The woman's smile didn't fade. Then we wait. We have waited 10,000 years. We can wait a little longer. Behind her, the gathered gods murmured agreement, a sound like wind through ancient forests, like waves on forgotten shores, like hope itself. And in that moment, Kaelen understood. They weren't here to fight. They were here to witness, to see if the line of Kaelen could finally break the cycle of sacrifice and solitude, to see if love could do what power never could. On the evening of the 3rd day, a dust cloud appeared on the eastern road. Kaelen saw it from the wall, his heart pounding with an intensity he hadn't felt since the Demon King's manifestation. Beside him, Ren's perception reached out, touched the approaching figure. She's alive, Ren breathed. They're all alive, and she's carrying something bright. The old gods stirred, their ancient eyes turning toward the road, toward the heart that had been stolen 10,000 years ago. Toward hope, Mira rode at the head of a small company, Black Banner Corps veterans who'd accompanied her on the mission, their faces exhausted but triumphant. In her arms, she clutched a box, simple, wooden, utterly unremarkable. But the light that emanated from it, the light was everything. She reached the gate and slid from her horse, her legs nearly giving out. Kaelen caught her, held her, breathed her in. "You made it," he whispered. "I told you I would." She pulled back, her eyes bright with tears and triumph, and held out the box. "Is this it? Is this what they need?" Kaelen looked at the box, at the light, at the old gods gathering behind him with expressions of wonder and hope and fear. "This is it," he said softly. "This is the beginning." He turned to face the gods, the beings his ancestor had wronged, the hearts he'd stolen, the hope that had waited 10,000 years. And he knelt, not as a warrior, not as a general, just as a man flawed, frightened, desperate to do the right thing. "I return what was taken," he said, his voice carrying across the valley. "Freely, willingly, with no expectation of forgiveness, no demand for reward. I return it because it was never mine to keep, because the line of Kaelen has spent too long taking when it should have been giving." He opened the box. Light exploded outward, pure, warm, alive. It washed over the old gods, and as it touched them, they changed. Their forms solidified, their eyes brightened, their hearts, metaphorical and literal, began to beat again. The woman who had spoken first, the one who seemed to be their leader, stepped forward and placed her hand on Kaelen's head. "You have done what your ancestor could not," she said softly. "You have broken the cycle. You have chosen love over duty, family over solitude, hope over fear." She smiled, and her smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "The line of Kaelen is redeemed." Behind her, the old gods began to sing. It wasn't music, not exactly. It was something older, something deeper, something that resonated in the bones and the blood and the soul. It was the sound of healing, of forgiveness, of home. Kaelen wept, and Mira, fierce, wonderful Mira, knelt beside him and held him while he shook. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it together." Together, the word echoed across the valley, carried by the gods' song, carried by the wind, carried by the hearts of everyone who had fought and bled. And together, that night, the Academy celebrated as it had never celebrated before. Not because the danger was past. It wasn't, not entirely. The old gods would need time to heal, time to remember who they'd been, time to find their place in a world that had forgotten them. The council would need to be convinced. The kingdoms would need to be educated. The future would need to be built. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight they celebrated survival, celebration love, celebration family. Mira found Kaelen at their usual spot, the bench overlooking the training ground. She sat beside him without speaking, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You're not brooding," she observed. "I'm reflecting. There's a difference." She laughed, that familiar, wonderful sound. "Sure there is." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their family dance and laugh and live. "I was so scared," Mira admitted quietly. "In that vault, surrounded by council guards, holding that box and knowing that everything depended on me getting out alive. I was so scared I'd fail you." Kaelen's arm wrapped around her shoulders. "You could never fail me. Even if you'd come back empty-handed, even if the mission had failed, you'd still be here, still alive, still you. That's all that matters." Mira's eyes glistened. "You really mean that?" "I really do." He squeezed her gently. "You taught me that, you know. That success isn't about winning. It's about showing up, trying, being there for the people who need you." Mira smiled. "Look at you, getting all wise in your old age." "I've had a good teacher." They watched the celebration together, two warriors who'd found each other when they needed it most. Behind them, the old gods sang on, a song of healing, of hope, of a future finally worth believing in. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the valley, the raven with glowing red eyes watched from a distant tree. It watched the light, watched the joy, watched the hope. Then it turned and flew toward the void, toward the darkness between stars, toward the place where something even older than the old gods was stirring. Something that had been waiting for this moment. Something that fed on hope. The raven cawed once, twice, 3 times, and in the void eyes opened. Eyes that had watched 10,000 years of struggle, 10,000 years of healing, 10,000 years of hope slowly building toward this moment. eyes that smiled. Finally, a voice whispered across the void. Finally, they're ready. The darkness shifted, and somewhere far away, a new war began to stir. Chapter 15. The Void's Answer. 3 months passed in a blur of rebuilding and revelation. The old gods didn't leave the valley. They couldn't, not yet. Their hearts, returned but still fragile, needed time to fully integrate with beings who'd spent 10,000 years as hollow shells. The academy became their sanctuary, its grounds expanding to accommodate hundreds of ancient beings who were learning to be whole again. Kaelen walked among them daily, learning their stories, their histories, their names. They weren't gods in the way humans understood the term. They were something older, something closer to guardians, protectors of the flame that kept the void at bay. And the void, they explained, was real. Not a metaphor, the woman, her name was Aelith, told him one evening. Not a concept, a place, a presence. The darkness between stars, the silence between heartbeats, the emptiness that waits for all things to end. Her ancient eyes held depths of memory that made Kaelin's 3 centuries feel like an eye blink. Your demon king was a servant of that void, a fragment of its will given form and purpose. He was dangerous, yes, but he was also a warning, a sign that the void is waking. Kaelin's blood ran cold. Waking for what? Aelith looked toward the mountains, toward the place where her kin had been imprisoned for 10 millennia. For us, for you, for everything that burns with the light of life. She turned back to him, and in her eyes he saw something he'd never expected from a god. Fear. The void fears hope, she continued quietly. It fears connection, love, the bonds that make life worth living. That's why it sent the Demon King, to break those bonds before they could grow strong enough to resist it. And when he failed, when you and your students proved that hope could survive even the deepest darkness, it noticed, Kaelen finished. The void noticed us. Aelith nodded slowly. And now it's coming. Mira took the news better than expected. So we've got another enemy, she said flatly, standing in the war council that had formed around Kaelen. Bigger than the Demon King, older than the old gods. And it's coming here because we hoped too hard, she laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, and I've heard some stupid things. Ren spoke quietly from his corner. It's not stupid, it's terrifying. The void doesn't fight with armies or weapons, it fights with despair. It turns hope against itself, makes you doubt everything you believe, everyone you love. His perception had been reaching toward the void since Aelith's warning, and what he'd felt had left him pale and shaken. If it reaches us before we're ready, then we get ready faster. Mira's voice was steel. We've done impossible things before, we'll do them again. Celia unrolled maps across the table, her tactical mind already working. The old gods are healing, but they're not combat ready. The veterans are trained but exhausted. The students are motivated but inexperienced. We need time, months, maybe years, to prepare for something on this scale. We don't have years. Darian's voice was grim. The void doesn't move slowly. Once it sets its sights on something, it comes with the weight of eternity behind it. We're lucky to have weeks. Kaelen listened to them argue, letting the voices wash over him. 3 centuries ago, he'd have made this decision alone, weighed the option, chosen a path, issued orders. Now, surrounded by people he trusted, people who challenged him, people who loved him, he did something different. He asked, "What do you think we should do?" The table went silent. 7 students, 1 ancient god, and his oldest friend stared at him. Mira recovered first. "You're asking us. You're the ones who'll have to live with the consequences." Kaelen's voice was quiet but certain. "You're the ones who'll fight, who'll bleed, who'll maybe die. You deserve a voice in how that happened." Ren spoke first. "We reach out to every kingdom, every academy, every person who might stand with us. The void wants us isolated, so we refuse to be isolated." Celia nodded. "We build alliances. Mira's already started that. We need to finish it. Turn the continent into a united front." Lily's voice was soft but firm. "We heal. The old gods, the veterans, ourselves. We can't fight despair if we're carrying our own." Mira stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "And we train, harder than ever, not just to fight, to hope, to build bonds so strong that nothing can break them, to become the thing the void fears most." One by one, the others added their voices, strategies, ideas, dreams. By the time they finished, they had a plan, a real plan built not by one mind but by many. Kaelen looked at them, his family, his hope, his reason for fighting, and felt something he'd never felt before. Not duty, not obligation. Pride. Then let's get started, he said quietly. We've got a void to face. The weeks that followed were the most intense of anyone's life. Mira traveled constantly, visiting kingdoms that had once mocked the academy, building alliances with rulers who'd never taken her serious. Her reputation preceded her, the girl who'd faced a shade with a stick, who'd shared an ancient warrior's burden, who'd stood against the demon king and won. Doors opened where they'd once slammed shut. Ren expanded his perception daily, reaching toward the void, mapping its approach, learning its pattern. The effort cost him. He aged visibly, dark circles forming under his eyes, his body growing thin and strained. But he never stopped, couldn't stop, because every moment of warning was a moment his family could prepare. Lily established a healing network that spanned the continent, training students in techniques that strengthened not just bodies but spirits. She discovered that hope could be cultivated, nurtured, grown, and she poured that discovery into everyone she touched. Celia coordinated everything, her tactical mind finally finding a challenge worthy of its scale. Supply lines, communication networks, training schedule. She wove them all into a single, functioning whole, turning chaos into order with quiet efficiency. And Kaelen trained. Not soldiers, he'd done that already. Not strategies, Celia had those covered. He trained connections, bonds, the invisible threads that tied people together and made them stronger than any army. He walked among the old gods, learning their songs, their stories, their light. He sat with the veteran, hearing their fears, their hopes, their dreams for a future they'd never expected to see. He held his students when they faltered, celebrated when they succeeded, loved them with everything he had. Because Aelith had told him the truth, the void couldn't be fought with weapons. It could only be fought with the one thing it could never understand: love. The first sign came on a moonless night. Ren collapsed in the middle of dinner, his body seizing, his eyes rolling back. Lily caught him before he hit the ground, her healing magic already flowing. But this wasn't an injury she could mend. He's connected, she gasped. Too deep, the void, it's pulling him. Kaelen was there in an instant, his hands on Ren's temple, his consciousness reaching toward the boys. He'd shared a bond with Ren since the binding ritual. They were connected, all of them in ways that transcended normal understanding. He used that connection now, following it into the darkness. What he found there made his blood freeze. Ren stood at the edge of an infinite abyss, a wound in reality that stretched farther than sight, farther than thought, farther than hope. Below him, things moved in the darkness, things with too many eyes, too many mouths, too much hunger. Ren, Kaelen's voice echoed across the void. Ren, you need to pull back. The boy turned and his face was streaked with tears. I can't, it's too beautiful. Beautiful? Kaelen looked at the abyss, at the writhing darkness, the endless hunger, the absolute absence of light, and felt nothing but horror. But Ren saw something else. Look deeper, the boy whispered. Past the hunger, past the fear, there's something there, something waiting. Kaelen looked and saw. Beneath the void's terrible surface, beneath its hunger and its hatred and its endless, endless dark, there was something else. Something that looked almost like a heart, a core of pure potential waiting to be shaped, waiting to be loved. The void isn't Ren breath. It's empty. It's been empty since the beginning of time, and it doesn't understand why we're not, why we burn with light when it has nothing. It's not trying to destroy us, it's trying to understand. Kaelen stared at the heart of darkness and felt something shift inside him. Not fear, compassion. He pulled Ren back with difficulty. The boy didn't want to leave, drawn by the void's terrible beauty. But eventually, they returned to their bodies, to the academy, to the family waiting with held breath. Ren woke gasping, his eyes wide with wonder rather than fear. It's not what we thought, he said immediately. The void, it's not an enemy. It's a child, a lonely, frightened child that's been alone since before time began. It sees our light and doesn't understand why it can't have any. It reaches out to take because it doesn't know how to ask. The council chamber erupted. Darian argued. Celia strategized. Even Mira, usually so quick to find the hopeful angle, looked skeptical. But Kaelen was quiet, because he understood. He'd been alone for 3 centuries. He'd reached out in ways that hurt people, pushed them away because he didn't know how to let them in. If someone had shown him compassion instead of fear, if someone had taught him instead of fighting him, it might be a trap, he said quietly, and the room fell silent. It might be exactly what it seemed, a void that wants to consume everything we are. But Ren saw something else. And I've learned to trust what Ren sees. He looked at his family, at the people who'd taught him that love was stronger than fear. So here's what we do. We prepare for war because we'd be fools not to, but we also prepare for something else. We prepare to reach out, to offer the void what it's never had. Mira's eyes widened. You want to befriend the darkness? I want to try. Kaelen's voice was steady. Because if we're wrong, if it's truly evil, we fight and maybe we die and that's the end. But if we're right, if there's something in that void that can be saved. He looked at Ren, at the wonder still shining in the boy's eyes. Then we have a chance to do more than win a war. We have a chance to heal an old wound, to create something new. The silence stretched. Then Aelith spoke, her ancient voice carrying the weight of 10,000 years. The void was not always empty. Once, long ago, it held a light, the first light, the one from which all others were born. But that light grew lonely, and in its loneliness it withdrew. It pulled back into itself deeper and deeper, until all that remained was the absence it left behind. She looked at Kaelen with eyes that held the memory of beginnings. What you're sensing, what the boy sensed, is that original light, buried beneath eons of loneliness but not extinguished, not gone, just waiting. Kaelen nodded slowly. Waiting for what? Aelith smiled, a sad knowing expression, waiting for someone to remind it that it's not alone. The plan that emerged was the most audacious anyone had ever attempted. Not war, not defense, contact. Ren would serve as the bridge, his perception reaching into the void, carrying a message of hope and connection. The old gods would lend their strength, their ancient light serving as a beacon. The students would surround them all, their bonds creating a network of support that could withstand the void's loneliness. And Kaelen would speak, not as a warrior, not as a general, just as someone who understood what it meant to be alone, to reach out in darkness, to find nothing but silence. If it works, Mira said slowly, if you actually reach it, what then? Kaelen shook his head. I don't know, maybe nothing, maybe everything, but we won't know unless we try. Mira looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly, she smiled, that fierce, brilliant smile that had first caught his attention all those months ago. You're insane, she said. You know that, right? I've been told. Good, just checking. She grabbed his hand and squeezed. Let's go talk to a void. The ritual began at midnight, under a sky empty of stars. Ren sat at the center of a circle formed by the 7 original students, their hands linked, their bonds pulsing with shared strength. Around them, the old gods sang, that ancient, wordless song that resonated in the bones and the blood and the soul. And at the edge of the circle, Kaelen waited. Ren's eyes closed, his breathing slowed. His consciousness reached out, past the valley, past the mountain, past the boundaries of reality itself, into the void. The darkness welcomed him, not with hostility, not with hunger, just with emptiness. The vast, lonely emptiness of something that had been alone since before time began. Hello, Ren thought, sending the word like a gift. We see you. We know you're there. You don't have to be alone anymore. Silence. Then faintly, a stirring. Something old and vast and terribly lonely turning toward the light. Who? The thought was hesitant, confused, like a child learning to speak. Who speaks in the dark? Ren's heart soared. Someone who understands, someone who's been alone too, someone who wants to help. Around him, the students poured their strength into the connection. The old gods added their light, and Kaelen stepped forward, adding his voice to the chorus. We're here, he thought, and his thought carried the weight of 3 centuries of solitude, of longing, of hope. We're here and we're not leaving. You don't have to be alone anymore. None of us do. The void shuddered, and in the darkness between stars, something that had been sleeping since the beginning of time began to wake. Not to destroy, to respond. The light that erupted from the valley that night was seen across the continent. It wasn't violent. It was gentle, warm, welcoming. It reached toward the void, toward the darkness, toward the ancient loneliness that had plagued existence since the first moment of creation. And the void answered, not with hunger, not with hatred, with something that sounded almost like a sob. So long, the thought came, fragile as a whisper. So long alone, so long waiting, I thought everyone had forgotten. Kaelen's heart clenched. We hadn't forgotten. We just didn't know, we didn't understand, but we're here now. We see you, we feel you. The void's presence pressed closer, hesitant, afraid. You're not afraid of me. We were, at first. Mira's thought joined Kaelen's, fierce and honest. But we learned that fear isn't the only way to respond to something different. Sometimes, she paused and her thoughts softened, sometimes the right response is love. Love, the word echoed across the void, through the darkness, into the ancient heart that had been waiting since before time. And something broke, not violently, gently, like a dam finally releasing after millennia of pressure. Light began to seep from the void's depths, not the borrowed light of stars, but its own light, its original light, buried so deep it had forgotten it existed. I remember, the void whispered. I remember now. I was light once. I was hope. I was everything. You still are, Kaelen said. You just forgot. And forgetting isn't the same as losing. You can always remember again. The light grew brighter. The void's presence shifted, transformed, and when it spoke again, its voice was no longer empty. It was alive. Dawn broke over a valley transformed. The old gods wept with joy, their ancient song shifting from mourning to celebration. The students held each other, exhausted but triumphant. And Kaelen stood at the edge of the circle, watching the sky lighten, and felt something he'd never expected to feel again. Complete and total peace. Mira appeared beside him, her face streaked with tears and dirt, and the most beautiful smile he'd ever seen. We did it, she whispered. We actually did it. Kaelen pulled her close, holding her like she was the most precious thing in existence. We did it together, he corrected. That's the only way it works. Mira laughed, that familiar, wonderful sound. Look at you getting all wise in your old age. I've had good teachers. They stood together as the sun rose, as the light spread, as the world woke to a new day. Behind them, the void's presence pulsed gently, not as darkness anymore, but as something new, something that was learning to be light. And somewhere in the distance, the raven with glowing red eyes watched from a tree branch. It watched the light, watched the joy, watched the hope. Then it turned and flew toward the rising sun, not toward darkness, but toward something else, toward a future that finally, held the possibility of peace. The raven cawed once, not a warning, not a threat, just a simple acknowledgement. And then it was gone. Bonus chapter, Epilogue: A New Dawn. 1 year later, the valley had transformed beyond recognition. Where once stood a crumbling academy with 7 students and a broken old man, now rose a sprawling complex of buildings, training halls, dormitories, libraries, healing center. Students from across the continent came to study, drawn by legends that grew with each retelling. Veterans who'd spent centuries waiting finally had purpose. Old gods walked among mortals, sharing wisdom that predated human civilization. And at the center of it all, Kaelen sat on his bench, watching the sunrise. You're brooding again. Mira's voice, familiar as his own heartbeat. She dropped onto the bench beside him, nudging his shoulder with hers. I'm appreciating, he corrected. There's a difference. She grinned, that fierce, wonderful expression that had become his favorite sight in the world. Sure there is. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the academy come to life. Students poured into training grounds, their laughter carrying on the morning breeze. Veterans moved among them, patient and skilled. Old gods meditated in quiet corners, their presence a gentle warmth that permeated everything. It's beautiful, Mira said softly. What we built, what everyone built. Sometimes I can't believe it's real. Kaelen nodded slowly. I know the feeling. 3 centuries of darkness, and now, he gestured at the valley, at the life, at the hope. Now this. Mira leaned her head against his shoulder. You did this, you know. You're the one who started it, who believed in us when no one else would. I believed in you because you gave me reason to. His arm wrapped around her, holding her close. All of you. You taught me that being strong doesn't mean being alone, that the greatest warriors aren't the ones who fight best, they're the ones who love most. Mira's eyes glistened. Look at you, getting all philosophical in your old age. I'm reflecting, there's a difference. She laughed, and the sound carried across the valley like music. The day passed in a blur of activity. Kaelen taught classes, not combat, but something he'd come to value more: connection. He showed students how to build bonds, how to trust, how to love. He shared stories of his 3 centuries alone, of the darkness he'd carried, of the light that had finally found him. Mira led training sessions, her fierce energy inspiring a new generation of warrior. Ren guided students in perception, teaching them to feel the world around them. Lily healed bodies and spirits with equal skill. Celia coordinated the Academy's expansion, her tactical mind finding elegant solutions to impossible problems. And the old gods walked among them. Alith found Kaelen as the sun began to set. "You've done well," she said quietly, settling beside him on the bench. "More than well. You've created something that will outlast you, outlast me, outlast all of us." Kaelen shook his head. "I didn't create anything alone. Every person in this valley contributed. Every student, every veteran, every god. This is our creation, not mine." Alith smiled, that warm, ancient expression that held the weight of 10,000 years. "That's exactly why it will last, because it's not built on one person's strength. It's built on everyone's love." They sat together as the sun sank lower, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. "The void," Kaelen said quietly. "How is it?" "Healing slowly. It's learning to be light again, learning to connect, learning to love." Alith paused. "It asked about you, wanted to know how you—" Kaelen's eyebrows rose. "It remembers me. It remembers everyone who reached out, everyone who showed it kindness." Alith turned to face him fully. "You changed something fundamental, Kaelen, not just in the void, in the universe. You proved that darkness isn't permanent, that even the oldest wounds can heal." Kaelen was quiet for a long moment, then slowly he smiled. "I had good teachers." That night the Academy celebrated. Not a formal event, just people gathering, sharing food and stories and laughter. Students danced with veterans. Old gods sang their ancient song. The valley blazed with light and joy and the simple pleasure of being alive. Mira found Kaelen at their usual spot, watching from the edges. "You know," she said, dropping onto the bench, "for someone who claims to be appreciated, you spend a lot of time away from the party." "I'm supervising. There's a difference." She laughed. "Sure there is." They sat together, watching their family celebrate. "I have something for you," Mira said suddenly, reaching into her pocket. "It's stupid, probably, but I saw it and thought of you." She held out a small object, a carving, simple but beautiful, of a figure sitting on a bench. Kaelen took it carefully, turning it over in his hands. "It's you sitting on your bench, brooding." Mira's voice was soft. "I made it myself. Took forever. I'm not exactly artistic, but I wanted you to have something that reminded you of this place, of us, of everything we built together." Kaelen stared at the carving, at the crude but heartfelt representation of himself, and felt tears prick his eyes. "It's perfect," he whispered. "It's absolutely perfect." Mira beamed. Yeah. He tucked the carving carefully into his shirt, close to his heart. "I'll treasure it always." They sat together as the celebration continued around them. Two warriors who'd found each other when they needed it most. "I love you, you know," Mira said quietly. "Not in a weird way, in a family way. You're my family, Kaelen, the dad I never had." Kaelen's arm tightened around her shoulders. "And you're the daughter I never knew I need, the one who taught me that it's never too late to start living." Mira sniffled, wiping her eyes. "Stop it, you're making me cry. I'm expressing, there's a difference." She laughed through her tears, and the sound was the most beautiful thing Kaelen had ever heard. Later that night, after the celebration wound down and the valley grew quiet, Kaelen walked alone to the eastern wall. The same wall where he'd stood a year ago, watching Mira leave for the capital. The same wall where he'd faced the old gods, the void, the end of everything. Now he stood under a sky full of stars, feeling at peace. Footsteps approached, familiar, steady. Darian. "Couldn't sleep either." Kaelen shook his head. "Too much to think about." Darian leaned against the wall beside him. 3 centuries I waited for. 3 centuries of watching everyone die, of wondering if you'd ever come back. And now," he gestured at the valley, at the academy, at the life that filled it. "Now this. I still can't quite believe." "Neither can I." Kaelen was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Darian, for waiting, for believing, for never giving up on me." Darian's voice was rough. "You're my brother. There was never any other option." They stood together in comfortable silence, 2 ancient warriors who'd survived against all odds. "What's next?" Darian asked finally. "Now that the void's healing, the old gods are settled, the academy's thriving, what do we do?" Kaelen looked at the stars, at the infinite possibilities stretching before them. "We live," he said simply. "We wake up every morning and choose to be present, to love the people around us, to build something that will outlast us." He turned to his oldest friend. "That's what I spent 3 centuries unable to do. Now I can. Now we can." Darian nodded slowly. Live, I think I can manage that. Good, because I'm going to need help keeping Mira out of trouble. Darian laughed, a real laugh, warm and full. Good luck with that. That girl's trouble with a capital T. She learned from the best. They walked back to the academy together. Brothers in arms, brothers in peace, brothers in life. The next morning, Kaelen woke to find a small package on his windowsill. No note, no indication of who left it. Just a simple wooden box, old and worn, tied with a faded ribbon. He opened it carefully. Inside lay a single object, a carving, similar to the one Mira had given him, but infinitely more skilled. It showed two figures on a bench, one old, one young, watching the sunrise together. The detail was exquisite, every line perfect, every expression captured with loving precision. And at the bottom of the box, a single word carved into the wood. Thank you. Kaelen held the carving, turning it over in his hands, and felt tears stream down his face. He didn't know who left it, didn't need to know. It could have been a student grateful for his teaching, a veteran grateful for his leadership, an old god grateful for his compassion, the void grateful for his love. It didn't matter. What mattered was that someone, somewhere, had been touched by what they'd built, by the hope they'd created, by the family they'd become. Kaelen placed the carving on his windowsill, beside Mira's gift, and looked out at the valley. The sun was rising over the academy, painting everything in shades of gold and hope. And for the first time in 300 years, Kaelen looked forward to the day ahead. Not with duty, not with obligation, with joy. Mira found him at their bench, watching the sunrise. You're smiling, she observed, dropping beside him. That's new. I'm practicing, there's a difference. She laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder. Sure there is. They sat together as the valley woke around them, students rushing to training, veterans sharing stories, old gods meditating in peaceful corners. Life, in all its messy, beautiful complexity. I'm glad you found us, Mira said quietly. That day you walked through the academy gates, I'm glad you stayed. Kaelen's arm wrapped around her, holding her close. I'm glad you let me. They watched the sunrise together, two warriors who'd found their home. Behind them, the academy hummed with life, the life they'd built, the hope they'd created, the family they'd become. And somewhere in the distance, a raven with ordinary eyes, no longer glowing, no longer watching, flew toward the horizon, toward a future that held nothing but peace.